He left the horse tangled in the barbed wire and walked away without looking back. Hours later, they found the animal free, and beside it, a piece of colorful ribbon that could only have come from a girl in the village. The Montana morning bit at Ellie Blackwater's cheeks as she walked the gravel shoulder of County Road 22, the red and yellow beaded strip in her black hair catching the early sunlight. She kept her eyes down, counting cracks in the pavement while cars rumbled past. Some slowed, locals who recognized the quiet Lakota girl making her daily trek to Pinecrest High. Most didn't bother. When the blue pickup full of senior boys approached, Ellie tucked her second-hand jacket tighter around herself, knowing what was coming. "Hey, Pocahontas," a voice called as they slowed beside her. "Want to ride on something better than a horse?" Laughter erupted from the truck as it accelerated away, leaving a cloud of exhaust that stung her eyes. Ellie's face remained impassive, a skill perfected over 16 years of similar encounters, in a town where being half Indian made her neither fully accepted by whites nor fully embraced on the reservation that bordered Pinecrest to the north. The school parking lot was already full when she arrived. Groups of students clustered around cars, their voices dropping as she passed. Ellie slipped through the main doors, past bulletin boards advertising the fall festival and homecoming nominations. The hallway parted slightly before her, not out of respect, but from the subtle aversion that followed her like a shadow. In the cafeteria, she claimed her usual corner table, unpacking a simple lunch of fry bread and apple slices that her grandmother Sophie had prepared before dawn. Through the streaked windows, Ellie noticed a small sparrow thrashing in the courtyard, its wing bent at an unnatural angle. She glanced around. No one was watching. Slipping her lunch back into her bag, she quietly exited through the side door. The bird's panic increased as she approached, its tiny body convulsing with fear. Ellie crouched, motionless, and began to hum, not toward the bird, but seemingly to the air itself, a low, gentle melody that had no words. After several minutes, the sparrow's movements slowed, its obsidian eye fixed on her, alert, but no longer frantic. "You got yourself in trouble, little one," she whispered, slowly extending her hand. The sparrow allowed her to cup it gently, its heartbeat racing against her palm. "Miss Blackwater." The voice made her jump. Behind her stood Sarah Miller, the biology teacher, arms crossed over her cardigan. "The bell rang 5 minutes ago." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller." Ellie carefully rose, the bird cradled in her hands. "It's hurt." Mrs. Miller's stern expression softened as she approached. "Let me see." She examined the wing with practiced precision. "A clean break. It can heal." She studied Ellie's face with newfound curiosity. "The way you were holding it, most injured birds would be thrashing, trying to escape." Ellie shrugged. "They calm down if you sing to them right." "Fascinating." Mrs. Miller checked her watch. "Take it to my classroom. There's a shoebox in my cabinet. You can make a splint from a popsicle stick and some gauze in the first aid kit. Then come straight to class." "Yes, ma'am." As Mrs. Miller walked away, she paused. "Ellie, that thing you did, the singing, I've never seen anything quite like it." After school, Ellie walked 3 miles to Quick Stop, the convenience store where she worked 4 evenings a week. Behind the counter, she rang up gas, cigarettes, and lottery tickets, her presence barely acknowledged by customers who stared through her when asking for their change. "Pump 4 needs authorization," mumbled a man in a hunting jacket, slapping a 20 on the counter without meeting her eyes. "Yes, sir." Ellie authorized the pump, sliding his change across the counter. The man took it and left without a word. "You're too quiet, girl," said Donna Carla, the middle-aged Guatemalan woman who owned the store, emerging from the back room with a box of beef jerky. "You need to speak up. Make them see you." "They don't want to see me, Donna Carla," Ellie replied softly, organizing the penny tray. "Their loss." Carla squeezed her shoulder. "You finish inventory, then go home early. Your grandmother called, said she needs help with the medicine bundles." The walk home took Ellie past the eastern edge of Midnight Creek Ranch, once the largest cattle operation in the county. Its sprawling acreage had been abandoned for years after Old Man Guthrie died, falling into disrepair until the for sale signs disappeared last month. Now, expensive trucks and construction equipment crowded the entrance. Workers had been repainting fences and renovating outbuildings. Rumors flew around town about the new owner, a Texas oil man with more money than sense. As Ellie passed, she spotted a sleek black Range Rover parked across two handicapped spaces in front of the ranch office. A tall man in an expensive suede jacket was gesturing emphatically to a foreman, his voice carrying across the yard. "I don't care about permits. I want those stables renovated by next week, not next month. I didn't pay $7 million for this place to wait around like some goddamn farmer." The man turned, revealing a weathered face with cold blue eyes. He noticed Ellie walking past and frowned, as if her mere presence offended him. She quickened her pace, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Sophie Blackwater was sitting on the porch of their small wooden house when Ellie arrived, her wrinkled hands methodically binding sage and sweetgrass into small bundles. At 73, Sophie's face mapped a lifetime of hardship and resilience, deep lines framing eyes that missed nothing. "You're early," Sophie observed, making room on the step. "Donna Carla let me go." Ellie settled beside her grandmother, automatically reaching for a bundle of herbs to tie. The new owner of Midnight Creek was there today. Sophie's hands paused. "I heard about him. Richard Thornton. Made his money taking oil from the earth without asking permission first." She resumed her work. People like that take and take until nothing remains. They worked in comfortable silence as the sunset painted the distant mountains gold. Finally, Sophie spoke again. "Your mother called to you last night." Ellie's hands stilled. "In your dream?" Sophie nodded. She was standing by the old cottonwood, singing the horse song. Her weathered fingers gently brushed Ellie's cheek. "She's been gone 5 years, but the spirits know when change is coming." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Her mother's face haunted her thoughts, the memory of the car accident still razor-sharp after 5 years. She slipped out of bed and opened her small cedar box, removing a faded photograph. Her mother astride a painted pony, laughing at the camera, her pregnant belly visible beneath a turquoise blouse. Her father wasn't in the picture. He'd never been in any picture, disappearing back to Minneapolis when he discovered his Lakota girlfriend was pregnant. Outside, the wind carried voices from town. Ellie opened her window and heard them coming from the direction of Lloyd's bar. Men's voices, loud with alcohol and bravado. "Paid $100,000 for a wild Mustang. Can you believe that? That Thornton fella's cracked. No horse is worth that much. It's not just any Mustang. Black as midnight, they say. Last of the truly wild bloodlines. Got captured up in the high country last month. Still crazy. Heard it already put 2 men in the hospital. Pure devil, that animal." Ellie closed her window, but the words lingered. A wild Mustang. The last of its kind. Captured. The following Sunday afternoon, Ellie hiked into the hills behind their house, gathering yarrow and mullein for Sophie's medicine bundles. The plants grew thickest near the creek that bordered Thornton's property. As she knelt by the stream, filling her cloth bag with herbs, unfamiliar sounds carried on the wind, angry shouts and the unmistakable scream of a terrified horse. Following the sounds, she crept through the pines until she reached a clearing overlooking one of Thornton's back pastures. What she saw made her blood freeze. 3 men wielded long ropes and cattle prods, surrounding the most magnificent horse Ellie had ever seen. Coal black from nose to tail, with no markings, its coat gleamed like obsidian in the afternoon sun. Powerfully muscled, it moved with the fluid grace of something truly wild, something that had never known fences or human hands. The Mustang reared, hooves slashing air, eyes wide with fury and terror. One of the men lunged with a rope, trying to snare its neck. The horse pivoted with impossible speed, delivering a kick that sent the man sprawling. "Get back, Rodriguez!" shouted another man. "That's the 3rd time he's nearly killed someone." A black truck pulled up, and Richard Thornton stepped out, his face dark with anger. "What the hell is going on? I thought you said you could handle this animal." The man called Rodriguez staggered to his feet, clutching his ribs. "Sir, with all due respect, this Mustang is different. I've worked with wild horses for 20 years, and I've never seen one like this. I paid good money for Thunderstorm, and I expect results, Thornton snapped. The Billings Expo is in 8 weeks, and I plan to show him there. Sir, he's caught his leg in the fence. We need to sedate him to get him free. Thornton squinted at the Mustang, now thrashing against a section of barbed wire where his hind leg had become entangled. Blood stained the black coat around a nasty gash. Leave him, Thornton decided. Let him tire himself out. We'll try again tomorrow. But sir, that wound… I said leave him. He'll learn there are consequences to fighting us. The men retreated to their vehicles, driving away despite the horses' continued struggles. Ellie remained hidden, heart pounding as she watched the magnificent animal fight against the wire that cut deeper with every movement. When the last truck disappeared around the bend, she made a decision that defied all logic. Slipping through the trees, she approached the fence line at a distance from the trapped Mustang. The horse spotted her immediately, rearing and screaming a warning despite his entrapped leg. Blood flowed more freely now, and his sides heaved with exertion and pain. Ellie sat down in the grass 30 yards away. She didn't look directly at the Mustang but kept him in her peripheral vision. Then, softly, she began to sing. It wasn't a song meant for human ears. It was one her mother had taught her, a song for the wind, asking it to carry her words to frightened spirits. The Lakota melody rose and fell like the breath of the mountains themselves, ancient words that spoke of running free beneath wide skies. The Mustang's frantic movements gradually slowed. His ears, previously pinned flat against his skull, swiveled toward her. Though he remained rigid with tension, his desperate thrashing ceased. For nearly 2 hours, Ellie sang to the wind as the sun began its descent. Between verses, she inched closer, never directly approaching, never making eye contact, simply existing in the same space as the wild creature. Twilight painted the mountains purple when she finally reached the fence. The Mustang stood trembling, his dark eyes fixed on her every movement. Blood matted his hind leg where barbed wire bit into flesh. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, the first human words she'd spoken. "But this will." With careful movements, she unwound the cruel metal from his leg, wincing at the deep lacerations it had created. The Mustang flinched but didn't strike out. When the last barb pulled free, Ellie backed away slowly. Before leaving, she untied the beaded strip from her hair and knotted it around the fence post nearest to where the horse had been trapped. The red and yellow beads caught the last light of day as she retreated. At the tree line, Ellie turned back one final time. The freed Mustang had taken a single step in her direction, as if reluctant to see her go. Their eyes met across the darkening field, predator and prey, both marginalized, both wounded by the same world, recognizing something elemental in each other that transcended words. The Montana morning bit at Ellie Blackwater's cheeks as she walked the gravel shoulder of County Road 22, the red and yellow beaded strip in her black hair catching the early sunlight. She kept her eyes down, counting cracks in the pavement while cars rumbled past. Some slowed, locals who recognized the quiet Lakota girl making her daily trek to Pinecrest High. Most didn't bother. When the blue pickup full of senior boys approached, Ellie tucked her second-hand jacket tighter around herself, knowing what was coming. "Hey, Pocahontas," a voice called as they slowed beside her. "Want to ride on something better than a horse?" Laughter erupted from the truck as it accelerated away, leaving a cloud of exhaust that stung her eyes. Ellie's face remained impassive, a skill perfected over 16 years of similar encounters in a town where being half Indian made her neither fully accepted by whites nor fully embraced on the reservation that bordered Pinecrest to the north. The school parking lot was already full when she arrived. Groups of students clustered around cars, their voices dropping as she passed. Ellie slipped through the main doors, past bulletin boards advertising the Fall Festival and Homecoming nominations. The hallway parted slightly before her, not out of respect, but from the subtle aversion that followed her like a shadow. In the cafeteria, she claimed her usual corner table, unpacking a simple lunch of fry bread and apple slices that her grandmother Sophie had prepared before dawn. Through the streaked windows, Ellie noticed a small sparrow thrashing in the courtyard, its wing bent at an unnatural angle. She glanced around. No one was watching. Slipping her lunch back into her bag, she quietly exited through the side door. The bird's panic increased as she approached, its tiny body convulsing with fear. Ellie crouched motionless and began to hum, not toward the bird but seemingly to the air itself, a low, gentle melody that had no words. After several minutes, the sparrow's movements slowed, its obsidian eye fixed on her, alert, but no longer frantic. "You got yourself in trouble, little one," she whispered, slowly extending her hand. The sparrow allowed her to cup it gently, its heartbeat racing against her palm. "Miss Blackwater." The voice made her jump. Behind her stood Sarah Miller, the biology teacher, arms crossed over her cardigan. "The bell rang 5 minutes ago." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller." Ellie carefully rose, the bird cradled in her hands. "It's hurt." Mrs. Miller's stern expression softened as she approached. "Let me see." She examined the wing with practiced precision. "A clean break. It can heal." She studied Ellie's face with newfound curiosity. "The way you were holding it, most injured birds would be thrashing, trying to escape." Ellie shrugged. "They calm down if you sing to them right." "Fascinating." Mrs. Miller checked her watch. "Take it to my classroom. There's a shoebox in my cabinet. You can make a splint from a popsicle stick and some gauze in the first aid kit. Then come straight to class." "Yes, ma'am." As Mrs. Miller walked away, she paused. "Ellie, that thing you did, the singing, I've never seen anything quite like it." After school, Ellie walked 3 miles to Quick Stop, the convenience store where she worked 4 evenings a week. Behind the counter, she rang up gas, cigarettes, and lottery tickets, her presence barely acknowledged by customers who stared through her when asking for their change. "Pump 4 needs authorization," mumbled a man in a hunting jacket, slapping a 20 on the counter without meeting her eyes. "Yes, sir." Ellie authorized the pump, sliding his change across the counter. The man took it and left without a word. "You're too quiet, girl," said Dona Carla, the middle-aged Guatemalan woman who owned the store, emerging from the back room with a box of beef jerky. "You need to speak up. Make them see you." "They don't want to see me, Dona Carla," Ellie replied softly, organizing the penny tray. "Their loss." Carla squeezed her shoulder. "You finish inventory, then go home early. Your grandmother called, said she needs help with the medicine bundles." The walk home took Ellie past the eastern edge of Midnight Creek Ranch, once the largest cattle operation in the county. Its sprawling acreage had been abandoned for years after Old Man Guthrie died, falling into disrepair until the "for sale" signs disappeared last month. Now, expensive trucks and construction equipment crowded the entrance. Workers had been repainting fences and renovating outbuildings. Rumors flew around town about the new owner, a Texas oil man with more money than sense. As Ellie passed, she spotted a sleek black Range Rover parked across 2 handicapped spaces in front of the ranch office. A tall man in an expensive suede jacket was gesturing emphatically to a foreman, his voice carrying across the yard. "I don't care about permits. I want those stables renovated by next week, not next month. I didn't pay $7 million for this place to wait around like some goddamn farmer." The man turned, revealing a weathered face with cold blue eyes. He noticed Ellie walking past and frowned, as if her mere presence offended him. She quickened her pace, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Sophie Blackwater was sitting on the porch of their small wooden house when Ellie arrived, her wrinkled hands methodically binding sage and sweetgrass into small bundles. At 73, Sophie's face mapped a lifetime of hardship and resilience, deep lines framing eyes that missed nothing. "You're early," Sophie observed, making room on the step. "Dona Carla let me go." Ellie settled beside her grandmother, automatically reaching for a bundle of herbs to tie. "The new owner of Midnight Creek was there today." Sophie's hands paused. "I heard about him. Richard Thornton. Made his money taking oil from the earth without asking permission first. She resumed her work. People like that take and take until nothing remains. They worked in comfortable silence as the sunset painted the distant mountains gold. Finally, Sophie spoke again. "Your mother called to you last night." Ellie's hands stilled. "In your dream?" Sophie nodded. She was standing by the old cottonwood, singing the horse song. Her weathered fingers gently brushed Ellie's cheek. "She's been gone 5 years, but the spirits know when change is coming." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Her mother's face haunted her thoughts, the memory of the car accident still razor-sharp after 5 years. She slipped out of bed and opened her small cedar box, removing a faded photograph. Her mother astride a painted pony, laughing at the camera, her pregnant belly visible beneath a turquoise blouse. Her father wasn't in the picture. He'd never been in any picture, disappearing back to Minneapolis when he discovered his Lakota girlfriend was pregnant. Outside, the wind carried voices from town. Ellie opened her window and heard them coming from the direction of Lloyd's bar. Men's voices, loud with alcohol and bravado. "Paid $100,000 for a wild Mustang. Can you believe that?" "That Thornton fella's cracked. No horse is worth that much." "It's not just any Mustang. Black as midnight, they say. Last of the truly wild bloodlines. Got captured up in the high country last month." "Still crazy. Heard it already put 2 men in the hospital. Pure devil, that animal." Ellie closed her window, but the words lingered. A wild Mustang, the last of its kind. Captured. The following Sunday afternoon, Ellie hiked into the hills behind their house, gathering yarrow and mullein for Sophie's medicine bundles. The plants grew thickest near the creek that bordered Thornton's property. As she knelt by the stream, filling her cloth bag with herbs, unfamiliar sounds carried on the wind, angry shouts and the unmistakable scream of a terrified horse. Following the sounds, she crept through the pines until she reached a clearing overlooking one of Thornton's back pastures. What she saw made her blood freeze. 3 men wielded long ropes and cattle prods, surrounding the most magnificent horse Ellie had ever seen. Coal black from nose to tail with no markings, its coat gleamed like obsidian in the afternoon sun. Powerfully muscled, it moved with the fluid grace of something truly wild, something that had never known fences or human hands. The Mustang reared, hooves slashing air, eyes wide with fury and terror. One of the men lunged with a rope, trying to snare its neck. The horse pivoted with impossible speed, delivering a kick that sent the man sprawling. "Get back, Rodriguez," shouted another man. "That's the 3rd time he's nearly killed someone." A black truck pulled up, and Richard Thornton stepped out, his face dark with anger. "What the hell is going on? I thought you said you could handle this animal." The man called Rodriguez staggered to his feet, clutching his ribs. "Sir, with all due respect, this Mustang is different. I've worked with wild horses for 20 years, and I've never seen one like this. I paid good money for Thunderstorm, and I expect results," Thornton snapped. "The Billings Expo is in 8 weeks, and I plan to show him there. Sir, he's caught his leg in the fence. We need to sedate him to get him free." Thornton squinted at the Mustang, now thrashing against a section of barbed wire where his hind leg had become entangled. Blood stained the black coat around a nasty gash. "Leave him," Thornton decided. "Let him tire himself out. We'll try again tomorrow." "But sir, that wound—" "I said leave him. He'll learn there are consequences to fighting us." The men retreated to their vehicles, driving away despite the horse's continued struggles. Ellie remained hidden, heart pounding as she watched the magnificent animal fight against the wire that cut deeper with every movement. When the last truck disappeared around the bend, she made a decision that defied all logic. Slipping through the trees, she approached the fence line at a distance from the trapped Mustang. The horse spotted her immediately, rearing and screaming a warning despite his entrapped leg. Blood flowed more freely now, and his sides heaved with exertion and pain. Ellie sat down in the grass, 30 yards away. She didn't look directly at the Mustang, but kept him in her peripheral vision. Then, softly, she began to sing. It wasn't a song meant for human ears. It was one her mother had taught her, a song for the wind, asking it to carry her words to frightened spirits. The Lakota melody rose and fell like the breath of the mountains themselves, ancient words that spoke of running free beneath wide skies. The Mustang's frantic movements gradually slowed. His ears, previously pinned flat against his skull, swiveled toward her. Though he remained rigid with tension, his desperate thrashing ceased. For nearly 2 hours, Ellie sang to the wind as the sun began its descent. Between verses, she inched closer, never directly approaching, never making eye contact, simply existing in the same space as the wild creature. Twilight painted the mountains purple when she finally reached the fence. The Mustang stood trembling, his dark eyes fixed on her every movement. Blood matted his hind leg where barbed wire bit into flesh. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, the first human words she'd spoken. "But this will." With careful movements, she unwound the cruel metal from his leg, wincing at the deep lacerations it had created. The Mustang flinched but didn't strike out. When the last barb pulled free, Ellie backed away slowly. Before leaving, she untied the beaded strip from her hair and knotted it around the fence post nearest to where the horse had been trapped. The red and yellow beads caught the last light of day as she retreated. At the tree line, Ellie turned back one final time. The freed Mustang had taken a single step in her direction, as if reluctant to see her go. Their eyes met across the darkening field, predator and prey, both marginalized, both wounded by the same world, recognizing something elemental in each other that transcended words. Dawn broke over Midnight Creek Ranch, bathing the weathered buildings in golden light. 2 ranch hands approached the back pasture where they'd left the wild Mustang trapped the previous evening, bracing themselves for another brutal struggle with the animal. "Holy..." The first man stopped in his tracks. The Mustang stood free of the wire, dark coat glistening in the morning sun, his wounded leg bearing weight despite the crusted blood around the gash. But what made both men stare was the small braid of colored beads hanging from the fence post, red and yellow catching the light like a strange ornament. "What the hell happened here, Martinez?" The older hand approached cautiously, keeping his distance from the notorious horse. Martinez shook his head, eyeing the Mustang with superstitious caution. "Maybe Mr. Thornton came back?" "Thornton wouldn't leave Indian beadwork," the older man muttered, squinting at the colorful strip. "Someone else was here." The Mustang watched them with alert, suspicious eyes. But something had changed. Though he remained at the farthest corner of the enclosure, his posture seemed less desperate than before. By mid-morning, a black pickup with Kentucky plates pulled into the ranch yard. Carson Reynolds stepped out, his weathered face tight with confidence. At 45, he'd broken more wild horses than most men would see in a lifetime. His reputation had been built on quick results, horses that submitted, whatever it took. Thornton greeted him with a firm handshake. "You come highly recommended, Reynolds. They say you can break anything with 4 legs." Carson assessed the distant black figure of Thunderstorm through narrowed eyes. "Let me see him." They walked to the enclosure where the Mustang paced restlessly. Carson studied the animal with clinical detachment, noting the powerful muscles, the proud carriage of his head, the untamed fire in his eyes. "Magnificent specimen," he acknowledged. "But I've seen this look before. Arabian stock in his bloodline, I'd bet. They're always the most spirited." He turned to Thornton with professional certainty. "I've already domed worse. He'll break in a week." Across town, Ellie's day unfolded in its familiar rhythm of invisibility. Between classes where teachers rarely called on her and lunch periods spent alone, she moved like a ghost through Pinecrest High. Only in biology did Mrs. Miller catch her eye, a silent acknowledgement passing between them about the rescued sparrow now recovering in a classroom shoebox. After school, Ellie worked her shift at Quick Stop, where the fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and artificial. As closing time approached, she carefully slipped 3 small apples from the produce section into her jacket pocket. Donna Carla pretended not to notice as she rang up the till. "You going somewhere after work?" the store owner asked casually. Ellie shrugged. "Just taking a walk." A walk that needs apples? Dona Carla smiled knowingly. Be careful, Niña. Some paths look simple until you're too far along them to turn back. The sun hung low when Ellie approached Midnight Creek Ranch from the back property line. She moved with practiced silence through the pines until she spotted the gap in the fence, a loose bottom wire she could easily slip under without being seen from the main buildings. Her heart pounded as she crawled through, fully aware she was trespassing on Thornton's property. But something stronger than reason pulled her forward, the memory of dark eyes meeting hers across a twilight field. The unexpected connection that had formed in those silent moments. The black Mustang stood at the opposite end of his enclosure, head high, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Ellie stopped 20 paces from the fence and simply sat down in the grass, pretending indifference. She pulled out her algebra homework and a pencil, arranged herself comfortably, and began working on equations as if sitting near a wild, dangerous horse was the most natural thing in the world. Occasionally, she'd glance up through her lashes to see Thunderstorm watching her, his ears pricked forward in curiosity. He maintained his distance, muscles tensed for flight, but his eyes never left her. After 30 minutes of calculated ignorance, Ellie began to hum, the same ancient melody she'd sung the previous evening. The sound drifted across the enclosure, carried by the gentle breeze. Thunderstorm's ears twitched, remembering. Half a mile away, unseen among the willows along the creek, Pete Jenkins lowered his fishing pole. At 72, the retired rancher still visited his favorite fishing spot on what used to be public land before Thornton bought it. The new owner hadn't discovered the old access trail yet, and Pete wasn't about to enlighten him. The sound of a girl's voice caught his attention. Curious, he retrieved small binoculars from his tackle box and focused them on the distant figure sitting calmly outside the Mustang's enclosure. "Well, I'll be," he whispered to himself, recognizing Sophie Blackwater's granddaughter. Meanwhile, in the main stables, Carson Reynolds was preparing his equipment. Ropes, a severe bit, spurs that would command respect. "First session is always about establishing dominance," he explained to Thornton. "The horse needs to understand who's in charge." "Whatever it takes," Thornton replied, checking his watch impatiently. "That animal cost me a fortune. I want him rideable for the Billings Expo." When they approached the enclosure an hour later, Carson carrying a coiled rope and wearing his specialized gear, the Mustang spotted them immediately. Thunderstorm transformed from the curious animal who'd been watching Ellie to a creature of pure defensive rage. He charged the fence line, teeth bared, eyes rolling white with fury. "Stand back," Carson instructed, entering the enclosure with confidence. "This is normal. He's testing me." What followed was a brutal dance. Carson attempted to corner the Mustang, swinging the rope with expert precision. Thunderstorm evaded each throw, his movements lightning fast despite the wounded leg. When Carson pressed closer, the horse reared dramatically, striking out with lethal front hooves that missed the trainer's head by inches. "Jesus Christ!" Thornton shouted from outside the fence. "Be careful!" Carson retreated, face flushed with unexpected exertion. "He's quick," he acknowledged grudgingly, "but they all submit eventually." 3 attempts later, Carson emerged from the enclosure with a bloody scratch across his cheek where the Mustang had struck him with a glancing blow. His professional composure had cracked slightly. "We'll try again tomorrow," he said stiffly. "Sometimes they need to think about who they're dealing with." After the men departed, Ellie remained motionless in her hiding spot among tall grasses. She'd witnessed the entire confrontation, her stomach knotting with each aggressive move toward the beautiful horse. Only when the ranch yard fell silent did she return to her homework spot. Thunderstorm stood trembling at the far end of the enclosure, sides heaving, eyes still wild with defensive fury. The wound on his leg had reopened, fresh blood darkening his coat. Instead of approaching, Ellie simply opened her thermos and poured water into her cupped palm, drinking slowly. Then she took out one of the apples, bit into it loudly, and continued her algebra problems as if nothing had happened. The days fell into a pattern. After school and her shift at Quick Stop, Ellie would slip under the fence and simply sit, maintaining a respectful distance from Thunderstorm's enclosure. Sometimes she'd read aloud from her textbooks, her voice soft and melodic. Other times she'd sing traditional Lakota songs her mother had taught her, songs about freedom and respect for all living things. Each day she noticed subtle changes. By her fourth visit, the Mustang was standing closer to her side of the enclosure when she arrived. By the sixth visit, he watched her intently as she placed an apple on the ground and backed away, pretending to focus on her reading. From his hidden spot by the creek, Pete Jenkins observed these interactions with growing fascination. He'd witnessed Carson's increasingly frustrated attempts to dominate the horse, each ending with the trainer storming away, often nursing new bruises. Yet here was this slip of a girl, doing nothing but sitting and singing, gradually drawing the dangerous animal to her through patience alone. One evening, after a particularly brutal session where Carson had attempted to use a cattle prod, only to be nearly trampled when the enraged Mustang broke through a section of fencing, Pete overheard a conversation that chilled his blood. "That animal has the devil in him," Carson declared, tossing his equipment into his truck. "You need to consider stronger methods." "Like what?" Thornton demanded. "Starvation works. Cut his water too. When they're weak enough, they stop fighting." Pete's weathered hands tightened around his binoculars. He'd seen such methods used in his younger days. Horses broken in spirit, not just trained. The light in their eyes extinguished forever. The next afternoon, Ellie arrived to find Thunderstorm standing directly at the fence, waiting. His ears pricked forward at the sight of her, a soft nickering sound escaping his throat, the first voluntary greeting he'd offered. "Hello to you too," she said softly, settling in her usual spot. She unwrapped her simple dinner, fry bread and dried berries, and began eating slowly. Between bites, she spoke to the air, never directly to the horse. "My mother used to tell me that every creature has two spirits," she said conversationally. "The spirit others can see, and the true spirit that only shows itself when it feels safe." She paused, chewing thoughtfully. "I think people forgot how to make anything feel safe." As she ate, she recalled a memory from childhood, her mother singing to a wounded eagle they'd found, explaining that the song wasn't for the eagle, but for the wind. "The wind carries our intentions," she'd said. "If our hearts are good, the wind tells them before our hands ever touch." Lost in thought, Ellie didn't immediately notice Thunderstorm approaching until his shadow fell across her homework. The Mustang stood just on the other side of the fence, closer than he'd ever been, his breath clouding in the cooling evening air. Her heart hammering, Ellie remained perfectly still. She placed the last apple on the ground, then slowly pushed it under the fence with her foot before returning to her textbook. Minutes passed. Then, with deliberate caution, Thunderstorm lowered his proud head and took the apple. The following morning, Carson Reynolds stormed into Thornton's office, his face mottled with fury. "Someone's interfering with my training. The horse had food that I didn't provide." Thornton frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I've been reducing his rations to make him more compliant, but someone gave him apples. I found the cores this morning." When they reviewed security footage from the camera mounted on a distant barn, they caught glimpses of a small figure sitting near the enclosure. The quality was too poor to identify the trespasser clearly. "Probably some animal rights activist," Thornton growled. "I'll have the hands patrol more frequently." But Pete Jenkins, watching Ellie's gentle patience day after day, knew what the wealthy men did not, that true power often came in forms they'd never recognize. When cameras were installed near Thunderstorm's enclosure, Pete made sure to warn Ellie, approaching her quietly one evening as she prepared to leave. "They're watching now, girl," he said softly, startling her. "Cameras on the north post." Ellie tensed, ready to run, but Pete raised weathered hands in a peaceful gesture. "I've been watching you with that horse. Never seen anything like it." "Are you going to tell Mr. Thornton?" she asked warily. Pete considered this, then shook his head. "Not yet, but be careful. That man doesn't understand anything he can't control." On the seventh day, when Ellie slipped through the fence line, Thunderstorm was waiting for her, standing alert at the nearest corner of his enclosure. When she settled in her usual spot, he nickered softly. a sound so different from his aggressive screams that it seemed to come from another animal entirely. As she opened her textbook, the black horse pressed against the fence, stretching his neck toward her, nostrils flaring as he drew in her scent. For the first time, Ellie reached out her hand, not quite touching him but allowing him to investigate her fingers. Thunderstorm's whiskers tickled her palm as he sniffed cautiously. Then, in a moment that stole her breath, he pressed his muzzle briefly against her hand before backing away. Unbeknownst to either of them, a newly installed camera captured this interaction. That evening, as Thornton reviewed the footage on his office computer, his expression darkened with fury. Reaching for his phone, he pulled up the contact for the sheriff's office. "I need to report a trespasser," he growled, crushing his whiskey glass in his other hand. "And I want them arrested immediately." No Native American girl was going to interfere with his plans for Thunderstorm, not when he'd invested so much. He'd remove this problem permanently, whatever it took. The crush of Thornton's glass echoed like a gunshot in his office. Outside the window, darkness had settled over Midnight Creek Ranch, but his rage burned bright. No one interfered with his investments, especially not some reservation girl with her superstitious nonsense. As he reached for his keys, determined to confront this trespasser immediately, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Mr. Thornton," came the foreman's voice. "There's something you should see at the quick stop in town." 20 minutes later, Thornton's Range Rover screeched to a halt outside the convenience store, tires kicking up gravel in the small parking lot. Through the fluorescent-lit windows, he could see a slender figure behind the counter, the same girl from his security footage. Ellie was restocking cigarettes when the glass door banged open. The sudden entrance of Richard Thornton made her freeze, recognition and fear flashing across her face. He strode directly to the counter, slapping printed photographs from his security cameras onto the scratched surface. "This is you," he stated flatly, jabbing a finger at the grainy image. "On my property, near my $100,000 investment." The few customers browsing the aisles turned to watch, conversation dying as Thornton's voice rose. "You're trespassing on private property, interfering with professional training. I could have you arrested." His face reddened as he leaned across the counter. "That Mustang is not some pet for you to play with. He's a valuable investment that you're ruining with your Indian mumbo-jumbo." Ellie stood rigid, her face a careful mask that betrayed nothing of the trembling in her hands. Years of enduring public humiliation had taught her to retreat inward during confrontations. But this was different. This wasn't about her. It was about Thunderstorm. "I was helping him," she said quietly. "His leg was caught." "That animal belongs to me," Thornton cut her off. "Everything on my property belongs to me. I decide how it's handled." The store had grown completely silent. Customers pretended to study merchandise while watching the confrontation unfold. Donna Carla emerged from the stockroom, her protective instincts flaring at the sight of Ellie cornered by the tall, imposing man. "Is there a problem here?" she asked sharply. "The problem is your employee trespassing on my ranch," Thornton replied without looking at her. "If she sets foot on my property again, I'll press charges. And I'll be speaking with her grandmother about the potential lawsuit they're facing." A shuffling sound from the back of the store drew everyone's attention. Pete Jenkins emerged from between the beer coolers, his weathered face set in lines of quiet determination. "I saw what that girl did," he said, his voice carrying despite its softness. "I've been fishing that creek for 40 years, long before you bought the place." Thornton turned, irritation flickering across his face. "This doesn't concern you, old man." "That Mustang nearly killed 3 handlers," Pete continued, approaching slowly. "I watched them try for days. Your Kentucky expert is getting nowhere fast." He paused, fixing Thornton with a steady gaze. "But that girl? She just sits and waits. And that wild creature who tried to kill grown men? He goes to her like a puppy." A murmur rippled through the small audience of customers. Thornton's jaw tightened as he realized the public nature of this confrontation was shifting the dynamic against him. "If she's so good with the devil horse," he challenged, "why doesn't she prove it? In front of witnesses?" Before Pete could respond, The convenience store door opened again. Sophie Blackwater entered, her small frame radiating quiet dignity despite the aluminum cane she leaned on. The store fell silent as she approached, her dark eyes taking in the scene with ancient wisdom. "My granddaughter doesn't break fences or rules, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice strong despite her years. "She heals what others break." Thornton shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "This is about trespassing, Mrs. Blackwater. Your granddaughter has the gift of our ancestors," Sophie finished for him. "The Kante Tipi, the ability to speak to the heart of living things." She looked at the security photos. "If she entered your land, it was because something there was suffering." An uncomfortable silence followed. The public confrontation had not gone as Thornton planned. Instead of intimidating a teenage girl, he found himself facing not only her formidable grandmother, but also the quiet judgment of the townspeople who had gathered to watch. "Fine," he said finally, gathering the photos with a sharp movement. "If she's such a horse whisperer, let's make it official. She can come to the ranch with supervision and show me what she can do with Thunderstorm." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "If there's value in her methods, perhaps we can work something out." The following morning, an unusual gathering assembled at Midnight Creek Ranch. Thornton stood with arms crossed beside Carson Reynolds, whose face remained skeptical. Sophie sat in a folding chair brought specifically for her, while Pete Jenkins leaned against a fence post nearby. Several ranch hands hovered curiously at a distance. Ellie approached Thunderstorm's enclosure slowly, acutely aware of the many eyes watching. The Mustang, sensing the crowd and the tension, paced nervously at the far end of the paddock, his previous progress seemingly erased by the presence of strangers. "This is ridiculous," Carson muttered. "The animal needs firm handling, not some girl singing to it." "Let her try," Thornton replied. "Then when she fails, we go back to your methods without interference." Ellie sat in her usual spot, opened her backpack, and took out her biology textbook. The observers exchanged confused glances as she simply began to read aloud, her voice soft and melodic, seemingly oblivious to both the audience and the nervous horse. Minutes stretched into a half hour. Thornton checked his watch repeatedly, impatience radiating from him. Carson smirked, clearly satisfied by what he perceived as failure. But Sophie and Pete watched more carefully. They noticed how Thunderstorm's pacing gradually slowed, how his ears, initially pinned back in stress, began to swivel toward the sound of Ellie's voice, how he would stop occasionally, head turning slightly in her direction, before resuming his nervous circuit. After 45 minutes, Ellie closed her book and began to hum, the same Lakota melody that had first connected her to the Mustang. The pure, simple notes carried across the enclosure, neither demanding nor pleading, simply existing like the wind itself. Thunderstorm stopped pacing. He stood facing Ellie, nostrils flared, dark eyes fixed on her. The observers held their breath as the Mustang took one step forward, then another. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered one of the ranch hands. By the end of the hour, Thunderstorm stood at the fence nearest Ellie, still cautious but visibly calmer than when she'd arrived. When she carefully placed an apple on the ground and pushed it under the fence with her foot, the horse approached and took it gently. Thornton's face registered surprise mingled with calculation. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he watched the interaction. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than the others. "Very interesting." Over the following weeks, Ellie's visits to Thunderstorm became an official arrangement. She would arrive after school, now entering through the main gate with permission, and spend 2 hours with the Mustang while various ranch employees kept distant watch. Gradually, something extraordinary began to unfold, not just between Ellie and Thunderstorm, but within the community itself. The first addition was Lisa Rodriguez, the local veterinarian, who arrived one afternoon with a notebook and camera. "I hope you don't mind," she said to Ellie. "I've been hearing about your work with this Mustang. I'm documenting unusual training approaches for a paper I'm writing." Ellie shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to object. Lisa settled at a respectful distance, her presence quiet and unobtrusive as she watched the girl simply existing in shared space with the horse, occasionally reading aloud or singing softly. "What exactly are you doing?" Lisa asked afterward, genuinely curious. "Not doing," Ellie corrected softly. "Being. My grandmother says animals don't care what we do until they know who we are." Word spread. Sarah Miller, Ellie's biology teacher, asked if she could bring students to observe what she called a remarkable example of interspecies communication. The first visit brought 5 teenagers who maintained a respectful distance, taking notes for their science project. Surprisingly, Thornton raised no objections to these visitors. He'd begun filming the sessions himself, occasionally showing the footage to associates on his phone, noting how the Mustang's physical condition had improved, coat shinier, weight filling out as his appetite returned to normal. Even Sheriff Davis, initially skeptical when he heard rumors of the miracle horse tamer, stopped by one afternoon. He stood with arms crossed, watching with professional detachment as Ellie sat near the fence, speaking in low tones to Thunderstorm, who now greeted her arrival with soft, nickering sounds. "She's not even using a rope," the sheriff commented to Pete, who had become a regular observer. "Doesn't need one," Pete replied. "That horse would follow her through fire if she asked." Remarkably, Carson Reynolds had been reassigned to other horses on the property. Though Thornton never officially dismissed him from Thunderstorm's training, the dynamic had shifted. Carson would occasionally watch from a distance, his expression unreadable as the Mustang, who had nearly killed him weeks before, calmly accepted an apple from Ellie's outstretched hand. The defining moment came on a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 2 months after Ellie's first encounter with Thunderstorm. A small crowd had gathered, Lisa with her camera, Sarah Miller with 3 students, Pete Jenkins, and several ranch hands who had become fascinated by the unusual training sessions. Thunderstorm stood at the fence as usual, greeting Ellie with a soft whicker. But today, instead of sitting in her usual spot, she slowly approached the fence until she stood directly before him. The onlookers held their breath, remembering the animal's violent history. With movements slow and deliberate, Ellie extended her hand toward the Mustang's powerful neck, a part she had never touched before. Thunderstorm remained perfectly still, dark eyes fixed on her face. Her fingers made contact with his sleek coat, gently stroking the muscled flesh beneath. A collective gasp rose from the observers. The untouchable horse, the demon that had sent 3 men to the hospital, stood calmly accepting human touch. As her hand moved up his neck, Ellie's fingers encountered something beneath the thick black mane, irregular ridges that didn't belong on a healthy horse. Gently parting the hair, she revealed what the beautiful coat had hidden: deep scars crisscrossing the skin, old marks from spurs and whips, telling a story of cruelty that had happened long before Thornton's ownership. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she traced the scars with gentle fingers. "I know," she whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed silence. "I have scars no one can see too." Thunderstorm lowered his head, pushing his muzzle against her shoulder in a gesture that seemed almost like comfort. Horse and girl stood connected in silent understanding. 2 beings marked by a world that had tried to break them, finding unexpected healing in each other's presence. Lisa's camera captured the moment, the flash briefly illuminating the pair against the golden afternoon light. The photograph would later appear in her research paper, then in a regional magazine, and eventually on websites dedicated to alternative approaches to horse rehabilitation. But in that moment, no one was thinking about documentation or publicity. They were witnessing something both simple and profound: trust, freely given between species that had every reason to fear each other. As Ellie continued to stroke the Mustang's scarred neck, Thornton watched from his office window, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, the girl has done remarkable work," he was saying. "The horse's value has tripled. She's some kind of savant with damaged animals." He paused, listening. "No, I don't know how she does it. Some Indian horse whispering thing." Another pause. "Of course, we could arrange a private viewing. The price would reflect the animal's unique qualities, naturally." That evening, when Thornton received a visitor from Texas in his wood-paneled office, neither man noticed Pete Jenkins walking his elderly dog past the window, close enough to hear snippets of conversation about methods that would make the animal truly valuable and, after we've gotten what we need from the girl. Pete's words lingered in the cool evening air as he walked away from Thornton's office window. Inside, deals were being made over whiskey and cigars, deals about Thunderstorm's future that had nothing to do with what was best for the horse. Dawn broke the following morning with a crystalline clarity that turned the Montana hills gold. Ellie arrived at Midnight Creek Ranch earlier than usual, drawn by a feeling she couldn't explain, a tightness in her chest that had awakened her before sunrise. Sophie had been in the kitchen, methodically sorting colored threads for a new set of traditional Lakota ribbons. "The red stands for the sunrise," Sophie explained, her arthritic fingers still nimble as they separated the vibrant strands. "Yellow for the sacred four directions. Blue for the sky that watches over us all." She paused, studying her granddaughter's face. "You're worried about the horse." It wasn't a question. Ellie nodded, accepting a finished braid of red, yellow, and blue ribbons from her grandmother's hands. "Every color has a meaning, a protection," Sophie continued. "Our ancestors understood that beauty is not decoration, it is medicine for the spirit." Now, as Ellie approached Thunderstorm's enclosure, the ribbons were carefully wrapped around her wrist. The Mustang stood at the fence waiting, his ears pricked forward in recognition. The transformation from the terrified, aggressive animal she'd first encountered to this alert but calm presence still amazed her. "Good morning," she said softly, reaching through the rails to stroke his nose. Thunderstorm's response was a gentle exhalation, his breath warm against her palm. His dark eyes, once filled with panic and rage, now held a wary intelligence, still cautious of the world, but accepting of her place in it. Lisa Rodriguez arrived as Ellie was carefully examining the healing gash on the Mustang's hind leg. The veterinarian set up her camera on a tripod, positioning it to capture their interaction. "The wound is healing cleanly," Lisa observed, keeping her distance out of respect for the bond between girl and horse. "No infection. He's allowing you to touch it now." Ellie nodded. "He still flinches sometimes, but he understands I'm not trying to hurt him." "What you're doing is remarkable," Lisa said, adjusting her camera settings. "I'm documenting it all for a paper on trauma response in equines. I'm calling it the Blackwater approach." Ellie looked up, startled. "You're naming it after me? Your methods challenge everything in conventional training manuals." Lisa gestured toward Thunderstorm. This horse was deemed untrainable by professionals with decades of experience. Yet here he is, voluntarily engaging with you after just a few weeks. The Mustang shifted, moving closer to Ellie as if sensing her sudden discomfort with the attention. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 cars pulled up near the enclosure. An old station wagon Ellie recognized as belonging to Mrs. Miller, Sheriff Davis's patrol SUV, and a pickup truck carrying James White Wolf and 2 other elders from the reservation. "Looks like you have an audience today," Lisa remarked. James White Wolf approached first, his weathered face solemn beneath a black hat adorned with an eagle feather. At 78, he was one of the most respected elders in the Lakota community, a keeper of traditional knowledge and tribal history. With him were Thomas Running Bear and Mary Cloudwoman, both tribal council members. "We heard about your work with the Black Horse," James said, his deep voice carrying the cadence of their shared language. He placed a small ceremonial drum on the ground beside him. "We came to witness what our ancestors would have recognized." Mrs. Miller guided her small group of students to a respectful distance. "Observe without disturbing," she instructed them quietly. "We're witnessing interspecific communication in its purest form." Sheriff Davis stood apart, arms crossed over his chest, his expression caught between skepticism and curiosity. He nodded briefly to Ellie but said nothing. Feeling suddenly self-conscious with so many observers, Ellie turned back to Thunderstorm. The Mustang had retreated several steps, his ears flicking nervously at the presence of strangers. "It's okay," she murmured, recognizing the signs of his anxiety. She began to hum softly, The same melody she'd used from their first encounter. James White Wolf's eyes closed in recognition of the ancient song. Gradually, Thunderstorm relaxed, his focus returning to Ellie despite the audience. She carefully unwrapped the braided ribbons from her wrist. "My grandmother made these for you," she told him, holding them up so the colors caught the morning light. "For protection." With slow, deliberate movements, she reached through the fence rails and began weaving the ribbons into his mane, singing softly as her fingers worked. Thunderstorm stood perfectly still, his breath steady, accepting her touch as if they'd shared this ritual 1,000 times before. James White Wolf began a soft drumbeat that matched the rhythm of her song. The sound seemed to expand across the pasture, connecting earth and sky. One of Mrs. Miller's students quietly took notes, his young face transfixed by the scene. Sheriff Davis uncrossed his arms, his professional detachment softening as he watched the wild Mustang lower his head, allowing Ellie to braid the sacred colors into his mane. "Never seen anything like it," he murmured to Pete Jenkins, who had arrived silently to stand beside him. "That's because you're used to seeing humans conquer," Pete replied quietly. "This isn't conquest. It's conversation." From his office window, Richard Thornton observed the growing gathering with mixed emotions. The publicity could increase Thunderstorm's value significantly. A wild Mustang so dangerous he'd hospitalized handlers, now responding to commands. But the involvement of the Lakota elders complicated things. Their presence lent a cultural significance he hadn't anticipated. He picked up his phone, dialing the number for Randall Hayes in Texas. "You should see this," he said when Hayes answered. "The girl has the horse wearing Indian decorations now. The locals are treating it like some kind of spiritual thing." He paused, listening. "Yes, that actually increases the exhibition value. People love that mystical Indian horse whisperer angle." Over the following days, Ellie's sessions with Thunderstorm took on a rhythm of their own. Each interaction built upon the last, trust accumulating in small, precious increments. When she arrived, he now trotted to the fence to greet her, nickering softly. She would speak to him about her day, her voice a gentle stream of words that seemed to soothe him regardless of their meaning. "Mrs. Miller asked me to present my biology project on interspecies communication," she told him one afternoon as she groomed his coat through the fence rails. "I think she means you and me." Thunderstorm's ear flicked toward her voice, his dark eye watching her with what almost seemed like understanding. "Sophie says you recognize my spirit," she continued, working tangles from his mane where the colored ribbons had become entwined. "That we're the same inside, where it matters." As the days passed, Lisa's documentation grew more comprehensive. Her camera captured the subtle progression, Thunderstorm gradually allowing Ellie to touch more sensitive areas like his ears and the underside of his neck, places that would have triggered violent defense mechanisms weeks earlier. "Look at his eye," Lisa pointed out to James White Wolf, who had become a regular observer. "See how the white no longer shows? That's a physiological indicator of reduced stress hormones." James nodded. "Our ancestors did not tame horses. They formed alliances with them. The first Lakota to approach the sacred beings understood that a horse willingly allied with you would give more than one that was broken." A significant breakthrough came on a brisk morning when frost silvered the grass. Ellie arrived to find Thunderstorm unusually agitated, pacing his enclosure with tense movements. Carson Reynolds had attempted another training session the previous evening, trying to assert his methods despite Thornton's apparent shift toward Ellie's approach. Instead of immediately approaching, Ellie sat cross-legged on the ground, closing her eyes. She began a soft chant, her breath visible in the cold air. For nearly an hour, she simply existed in the shared space, offering presence without demand. Gradually, Thunderstorm's agitation subsided. He approached the fence, watching her with cautious eyes. When she finally rose and walked to him, he lowered his head in a gesture that took her breath away, offering his forehead, the most vulnerable part of a horse, for her touch. "He's ready," James White Wolf said from where he sat nearby. "The bond is strong enough now." Ellie looked at him questioningly. "To carry you," the elder clarified. "Not as a burden, but as a companion." The idea sent a shiver through her. Despite their progress, she'd never considered actually riding Thunderstorm. The Mustang had been through so much trauma at human hands. Asking him to bear her weight seemed like a violation of the trust they'd built. "I don't have a saddle," she said hesitantly. James smiled. Neither did our ancestors when they first encountered the sacred beings. The following day, word had somehow spread. A small crowd gathered at a respectful distance. Ranch hands, townspeople, even a few of Ellie's classmates who had never spoken to her at school. Thornton stood with Lisa and Sheriff Davis, while Sophie sat in a chair provided by Pete Jenkins. Ellie approached Thunderstorm's enclosure with the gate key Thornton had finally entrusted to her. The Mustang watched her with alert interest as she slowly opened the gate and stepped inside, the first time she had entered his space rather than interacting through the fence. A collective intake of breath came from the observers. Everyone present knew the Mustang's violent history. Thunderstorm remained still, his eyes fixed on Ellie as she walked slowly toward him, palm extended. When she reached him, she simply stroked his neck, running her fingers along the raised scars hidden beneath his mane. "You've carried enough pain," she whispered. "You don't need to carry me too." But Thunderstorm stepped closer, pressing his body against hers in a gesture that seemed almost like invitation. Ellie glanced at her grandmother, who nodded once, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. With movements slow and deliberate, Ellie placed her hand on Thunderstorm's back. The Mustang remained steady. Taking a deep breath, she gathered the black mane in her hand and gently pulled herself up, sliding onto his bare back. There was no dramatic reaction, no bucking or panic, just a slight adjustment of his stance to balance her weight. Ellie sat motionless for several moments, allowing him to become accustomed to the new sensation. Then, with the lightest pressure from her legs, she suggested movement. Thunderstorm took a single step forward, then another. A murmur rose from the watching crowd as horse and girl began a slow circuit of the enclosure. No bridle controlled his head, no bit commanded his attention, just the light touch of Ellie's hands on his mane and the gentle pressure of her legs against his sides. "It's not training," Lisa explained quietly to Thornton, whose expression betrayed both amazement and calculation. "It's partnership. She hasn't broken his spirit. She's healed it." Sophie watched with quiet pride, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Beside her, James White Wolf nodded in silent affirmation, recognizing in Ellie's gentle communion with Thunderstorm the echo of ancient knowledge nearly lost to their people. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows across Midnight Creek Ranch, Thornton stood by the fence watching Ellie brush Thunderstorm before leaving. The transformation of both horse and girl was remarkable. The formerly aggressive Mustang now gentle under her touch, the shy teenager now moving with quiet confidence. His phone vibrated with an incoming call. Stepping away, he answered quietly. "Yes, the results are better than expected," he said, glancing back at Ellie. "The girl is some kind of prodigy with the animal." He listened briefly. "I'm filming everything. The value has at least tripled." When he ended the call, Thornton didn't notice Pete Jenkins walking nearby, close enough to hear his final words. "Once the exhibition is over, we'll move forward with our arrangement." Later that night, Thornton received a private video call from Randall Hayes, who had been watching recordings of Ellie's progress with keen interest. "That girl is incredible," Hayes said, leaning back in his leather chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand. "But imagine what we could do if I bought the horse and applied real training methods afterward, once she's gotten him manageable for us." Randall Hayes's words hung in the air like a threat. Thornton nodded, a calculating smile spreading across his face as he contemplated the profit potential. The Blackwater girl has certainly made progress faster than anyone expected. By the time of the Helena exposition, Thunderstorm will be ready for the spotlight, and for whatever comes after. 2 days later, Thornton's black Range Rover pulled up in front of Sophie Blackwater's modest home. The contrast was stark. His vehicle alone worth more than the entire property. He straightened his custom leather jacket before knocking on the weathered door, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Sophie answered, her ancient eyes taking his measure before silently inviting him in. The small living room smelled of sage and sweetgrass, walls adorned with traditional Lakota artwork alongside faded family photographs. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, homework spread before her, surprise registering on her face at their unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Blackwater, Ellie," Thornton began, settling uninvited into a chair. "I have a business proposition." He opened the portfolio, revealing professionally printed documents. "I've been impressed by Ellie's work with Thunderstorm. What she's accomplished in weeks has outpaced what professionals couldn't achieve in months." Ellie and Sophie exchanged glances but remained silent. "The Helena Exposition is 6 weeks away," Thornton continued. "It's the premier equestrian event in the region. Buyers, breeders, enthusiasts from across the country." He slid the contract across the table. "I'm prepared to hire Ellie officially as Thunderstorm's trainer for the exposition, with a generous salary. Additionally, if the horse places well or attracts positive attention, there would be a substantial bonus." Sophie reached for the papers, her weathered fingers moving methodically through the legal language. Her expression remained impassive, but her eyes narrowed at certain clauses. "And after the exposition?" she asked, looking up. "What happens to the horse then?" Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll assess the commercial potential of the animal at that point. There are multiple options: breeding programs, exhibition circuits, private sale to select collectors." "You mean you'll sell him?" Ellie said quietly. "That's business, young lady. I didn't invest in Thunderstorm as a pet." Sophie placed the contract on the table, her fingers resting protectively over the pages. "This animal has suffered at human hands. My granddaughter has begun healing those wounds. Would you reopen them once they've served your purpose?" Thornton shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "The horse will be treated as the valuable asset he is. Now, about the terms." "We will consider your offer," Sophie interrupted, folding the contract and handing it to Ellie. "We will pray on it and give you our answer tomorrow." Later that evening, Ellie sat on the porch steps, the contract beside her as she stared out at the darkening mountains. Sophie joined her, easing down with the help of her walking stick. "I don't trust him, grandmother," Ellie said. "Nor should you. Men like Thornton see the world as things to possess, not beings to respect." Sophie gestured toward the papers. "But sometimes we must walk into the wolf's den to protect what we care about." Ellie glanced at the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter visible through the window. Sophie's rheumatoid arthritis treatments, medications their limited insurance barely covered. The salary Thornton offered would cover those bills for months. "If I refuse, what happens to Thunderstorm?" she asked. "They will try their methods again, the ones that left scars." Sophie's voice was matter of fact. "Sometimes the only way to prevent harm is to stay close enough to witness it." The next morning, Ellie signed the contract, her signature a stark contrast to Thornton's bold scrawl. As she handed him the document, their eyes met in silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tensions beneath their agreement. At Quick Stop that afternoon, Donna Carla surprised Ellie by emerging from the back office with a revised schedule in hand. "I changed your shifts," she announced. "Afternoons free, mornings and evenings only. You need time to work with that horse of yours." Ellie blinked in surprise. "But the after-school rush, Jorge's boy Miguel will cover. He needs the hours anyway." Donna Carla waved away her concerns. "That horse needs you more than this store does right now. Besides," she added with a wink, "everyone's talking about Midnight Creek's Mustang and the Indian girl who tamed him when no one else could. It's good publicity even for us." Word spread quickly through Pinecrest. The quiet girl who had moved like a shadow through the halls of the high school was suddenly the center of attention, though Ellie found this new visibility almost as uncomfortable as her previous invisibility. The training sessions with Thunderstorm intensified under the formal arrangement. Ellie now spent 3 hours daily at the ranch, developing a routine based on mutual trust. Unlike conventional training that relied on dominance and equipment, her approach used minimal pressure and respected the Mustang's intelligence and dignity. One afternoon, Lisa Rodriguez sat on the fence watching as Ellie guided Thunderstorm through simple patterns, using only subtle shifts in her body position and quiet verbal cues. What you're doing challenges everything in conventional training manuals, Lisa commented, taking notes. You're not dominating him. You're communicating with him. Ellie shrugged, uncomfortable with the analysis of what felt natural to her. My mother used to say that horses already know how to be horses. They don't need us to teach them that. They just need to know we won't hurt them for being what they are. That's profound, Lisa said, jotting down the quote. Mind if I use that in my paper? Before Ellie could respond, a sleek silver truck pulled into the ranch yard. Pete Jenkins, who had taken to watching the training sessions from his usual spot under a cottonwood tree, straightened as he recognized the Texas plates. Randall Hayes emerged from the vehicle, tall, tanned, and expensive in custom boots and a tailored Western shirt. His smile was practiced as he approached the paddock where Thornton waited to greet him. That's the potential buyer, Pete murmured to Lisa. Big breeding operation in Texas, known for his efficient training methods. Ellie felt Thunderstorm tense beneath her hand, his instincts responding to the subtle shift in atmosphere. She stroked his neck reassuringly, fingers tracing the ridges of old scars beneath his mane. Hayes and Thornton observed from a distance, their conversation just beyond earshot. Occasionally Hayes would point toward Thunderstorm, his expression analytical, assessing value rather than appreciating the miracle of transformation occurring before them. After they departed toward the main house, Pete approached Ellie with a troubled expression. Be careful, girl, he said quietly. I've heard about Hayes's operation. Horses that don't perform to standard don't last long there. That evening, Ellie found James White Wolf waiting outside the paddock as she finished grooming Thunderstorm. The elder watched in silence as she braided a new set of protective ribbons into the Mustang's mane. Your grandmother told me about Thornton's offer, he said finally. You walk a difficult path. I don't know what else to do, Ellie admitted. If I refuse, someone else will train him. Someone who won't care about his spirit. James nodded thoughtfully. Our ancestors faced similar choices when the Wasichu first came with their promises and papers. He reached into a leather pouch at his waist, withdrawing a small bundle wrapped in buckskin. This is for the Mashungshka, the horse, traditional medicine to protect his spirit. Ellie accepted the small bundle, recognizing the sacred significance of the gift. Thank you. The exposition will test you both, James said. Not just your skills, but your courage to stand for what is right, even when standing alone. As the Helena exposition approached, Thornton became a more frequent presence at the training sessions. He would stand at the fence, filming with his phone, occasionally bringing associates to witness Thunderstorm's transformation. His comments increasingly focused on the exhibition value of the mystical connection between the Lakota girl and the once untamable Mustang. Play up the traditional angle, he instructed Ellie one afternoon. Wear something Indian, beads, feathers, whatever you people use. The judges eat that cultural stuff up. Ellie said nothing, but that evening she asked Sophie about the proper protocols for wearing ceremonial clothing. Our traditions are not costumes, Sophie replied firmly, but the horse ribbons, those are appropriate. They tell a story of connection, not performance. Throughout these weeks, a subtle shift occurred in Pinecrest. People who had previously ignored Ellie now greeted her in the grocery store. Teachers who had rarely called on her in class now solicited her opinions. Several of her classmates even began sitting with her at lunch, curious about her work with the famous Mustang. Is it true you can, talk to him with your mind? Asked Brittany Collins, a cheerleader who had never acknowledged Ellie's existence before. No, Ellie replied simply. I just listened to what he's already saying. One afternoon, Ellie arrived at the ranch to find Thornton showing Hayes and two associates something on his tablet, video footage of her working with Thunderstorm. Their conversation halted abruptly when they noticed her. Ah, Ellie, Thornton called with forced joviality. Mr. Hayes was just saying how impressed he is with your progress. Hayes smiled, all perfect teeth and practiced charm. Remarkable work, young lady. That animal was considered unmanageable. I'd be interested in seeing your techniques applied to some of my more challenging stock. Something in his tone sent a chill through Ellie. The way he said, techniques, as if her connection with Thunderstorm could be reduced to a method that could be copied, mass-produced. She murmured a polite acknowledgement before heading to the paddock, where Thunderstorm waited anxiously, picking up on her discomfort. "Something's wrong," she whispered, stroking his neck. "I don't know what, but I can feel it." The Mustang pressed his muzzle against her shoulder, his breath warm against her shirt. In these quiet moments, Ellie often felt he understood more than any human realized, the subtle currents of intention and betrayal flowing around them. On the eve of the exposition, Sophie spent hours weaving a special set of ribbons for Thunderstorm, red for courage, blue for truth, yellow for the sacred connection between all beings, white for harmony. As she worked, she taught Ellie the ancient prayers that accompanied each color. "For protection when you cannot be there," Sophie explained, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite her arthritis. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ellie slipped from bed and opened her window. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage as she looked toward the distant lights of Midnight Creek Ranch. A sense of foreboding had settled in her chest, a feeling that the exposition represented not a culmination, but a precipice. She recalled overhearing Hayes asking Thornton about transport arrangements and integration into the breeding program. The casual way they discussed Thunderstorm's future made her stomach knot with anxiety. The next morning, as Sophie helped her braid the ceremonial ribbons into her hair to match those she would place in Thunderstorm's mane, Ellie voiced her fears. "I'm afraid of what will happen after tomorrow, grandmother. Thornton sees him as property, not a being with his own spirit." Sophie's weathered hands stilled against Ellie's hair. "Then you must be his witness, and his voice. Sometimes that is all we can do, stand as witness to what others would ignore." At the ranch, Ellie found Thunderstorm unusually agitated, pacing his enclosure and tossing his head at every unfamiliar sound. When she entered the paddock, he pressed against her immediately, seeking reassurance. "I know," she whispered, stroking his neck. "I feel it too." As she groomed him for their final practice before the exposition, Ellie's fingers lingered on the small medicine bundle James White Wolf had given her, now secured discreetly beneath the colored ribbons in Thunderstorm's mane. Feeling a sudden, inexplicable urgency, she leaned close to his ear. "My grandmother says this keeps the spirit connected to the body, no matter the distance between them, and I fear we may need that very soon." Dawn broke in ribbons of gold and amber across the Montana sky as Ellie fastened the last of Sophie's ceremonial ribbons into her hair. Today was the day, the Helena Exposition, where everything they'd worked for would be showcased before hundreds of strangers. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her small bag containing extra ribbons, a brush, and the special dried herbs Sophie had prepared for Thunderstorm. The drive to Helena took nearly 2 hours, Sophie sitting silent beside her in Pete Jenkins' borrowed truck. The old rancher had insisted they use his vehicle when he learned their ancient station wagon was making troubling noises. "The spirit knows when change is coming," Sophie finally said as they approached the fairgrounds. "Trust what you've built with him. Your mother would be proud." The Helena Exposition was Montana's premier equestrian event, drawing participants from across 5 states. As they pulled into the designated parking area, Ellie's stomach tightened at the sight of elaborate horse trailers, professional handlers in pristine uniforms, and equipment that cost more than her grandmother's entire house. Thornton had arranged for Thunderstorm to be transported the previous evening in his custom trailer, insisting the horse needed time to acclimate to the new surroundings. Ellie had objected. The separation would stress the Mustang, but Thornton had been adamant. "This is business, not a petting zoo," he'd said dismissively. She found Thunderstorm in a temporary stall at the far end of the exhibition barn, away from the other horses. His eyes brightened when he saw her, a soft nickering sound escaping his throat as he pressed against the gate. "I'm here," she whispered, reaching through the bars to stroke his velvet muzzle. Relief washed through her as he pushed eagerly into her touch, but she could feel the tension in his muscles. The unfamiliar surroundings, strange horses, and constant noise had taken their toll. "How's our champion?" Thornton's voice boomed behind her. He approached with Randall Hayes and 2 well-dressed associates, all wearing exhibition credentials on lanyards. "He's anxious," Ellie replied, not taking her eyes off Thunderstorm. "Too many new sounds and smells." "Well, settle him down," Thornton instructed. "Our showcase is in 3 hours. I've invited several key industry people." As they walked away, Ellie heard Hayes murmur, "She's got him practically eating out of her hand. Impressive groundwork for what we'll do later." The Mustang sensed her unease, shifting nervously in the small stall. In the adjacent spaces, elaborately groomed horses stood wearing expensive bridles and show blankets. Thunderstorm, with only the colored ribbons woven into his mane, seemed both out of place and more magnificent for his natural beauty. Ellie slipped into the stall, closing the gate behind her. Without ceremony, she sat cross-legged in the corner on the clean straw. Thunderstorm circled once, then came to stand near her, his large body positioned almost protectively between her and the bustling aisle outside. "It's just for today," she told him softly, reaching up to stroke his foreleg. "Just show them who you are, not who they want you to be." For the next hour, she simply remained with him, sometimes singing softly, sometimes silent, allowing her calm presence to ground him in the chaos. Occasionally, curious spectators would pause to watch, the unusual sight of a teen girl sitting quietly in a stall with an unrestrained Mustang drawing attention. Lisa Rodriguez found them like this, camera in hand. "Everyone's talking about the wild Mustang and the Indian girl," she said, snapping a photo. "Thornton's been bragging to anyone who'll listen about his extraordinary investment." "We're just the opening act," Ellie replied, her fingers working tangles from Thunderstorm's mane. "Once the exposition is over, Hayes takes over the real training." Lisa frowned. His methods are controversial, to put it mildly. When it was time to prepare for their showcase, Sophie appeared with a small container of red clay. "For strength," she explained, painting a subtle line across Ellie's cheekbones. The gesture, so reminiscent of her mother's preparations for important events, brought unexpected tears to Ellie's eyes. Participants gathered in the warm-up arena, handlers polishing gleaming show tack, trainers giving last-minute instructions. Ellie stood out starkly. No saddle, no bridle, just her simple clothes and the traditional ribbons matching those in Thunderstorm's mane. Nearby, competitors stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. "What's the Indian girl going to do? A rain dance?" One handler snickered to another, loud enough for Ellie to hear. Thunderstorm's ears flattened momentarily, as if he'd understood the insult. Ellie placed a calming hand on his neck, whispering, "They don't matter." When their turn came, Ellie led Thunderstorm into the main arena without any physical restraint. A murmur rippled through the audience at the sight. A slender teenager and the magnificent black Mustang, connected by nothing visible to the eye. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. Next, from Midnight Creek Ranch, Thunderstorm, a previously untamable Mustang demonstrating natural horsemanship techniques with handler Ellie Blackwater. The arena fell silent as Ellie began. Without commands or equipment, she and Thunderstorm moved in perfect synchronization, the horse mirroring her movements, responding to gestures so subtle they were nearly imperceptible to observers. When she ran, he ran beside her. When she stopped, he stopped. When she extended her hand, he lowered his head to meet it. The crowd's initial confusion gave way to fascination. These weren't trained tricks or standard exhibition maneuvers. This was something more primal, a language without words between two beings who had recognized something in each other. For the finale, Ellie simply placed her hand on Thunderstorm's back and, with a small leap, mounted him bareback. The Mustang, who months before had been considered too dangerous to approach, carried her in a perfect circuit of the arena, responding to the lightest touch of her legs and hands. When they finished, the silence lasted 3 heartbeats before erupting into thunderous applause. Even the skeptical competitors watched with grudging respect as the Mustang that had hospitalized professional trainers performed complex patterns without a single piece of equipment. Judges conferred, their expressions animated. When scores were announced, Thunderstorm and Ellie had received the highest marks in the natural horsemanship category. Thornton beamed, shaking hands with associates and accepting congratulations as if the achievement had been his. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of interviews and photographs. Thornton positioned himself prominently in every shot, describing how he had discovered Ellie's talent and provided the opportunity for this extraordinary partnership to develop. Ellie answered questions politely but briefly, her attention constantly returning to Thunderstorm, ensuring he wasn't overwhelmed by the attention. As evening approached, the exposition crowds thinned. Ellie led Thunderstorm back to his stall, planning to stay with him until it was time to load for the return trip to Pinecrest. Sophie had gone with Pete to find dinner, promising to return within the hour. Exhausted but contented, Ellie brushed Thunderstorm's coat, speaking softly about their triumph. "You were perfect. Everyone saw who you really are, not just what happened to you." The Mustang pressed his muzzle against her shoulder, his breath warm and trusting. This quiet moment, connection without agenda, was what she treasured most. Her peace was shattered by the sound of approaching voices. Thornton entered the barn with Randall Hayes and two unfamiliar men in work clothes. Behind them, a large transport trailer was backing up to the loading area. Not Thornton's custom trailer, but a commercial horse transport with Texas plates. "There you are," Thornton said, his voice artificially bright. "Just finishing up, I see." Ellie's hand stilled on Thunderstorm's neck. "We'll be ready to head back to Pinecrest soon. Sophie's just getting dinner." "That's what I came to tell you," Thornton replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "Change of plans. Mr. Hayes has purchased Thunderstorm. He'll be transported to Texas tonight." The words hit Ellie like physical blows. "Tonight? But that's not... You said after the exposition season." "Business opportunity," Thornton interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Hayes made an exceptional offer after your performance today. The paperwork's already complete." Hayes stepped forward, his practiced smile never reaching his eyes. "You've done remarkable groundwork, young lady. We'll take it from here with proper professional methods." "You can't," Ellie protested, her voice rising. "He's not ready for transport to a new facility. The stress alone could—" "Don't be naive, girl," Thornton cut her off, his friendly facade slipping. "This was a business arrangement from the beginning. Thunderstorm is a valuable investment, not your pet." One of Hayes's men approached with a conventional halter and lead. At the sight of the equipment, Thunderstorm's demeanor instantly changed. His ears pinned back, nostrils flaring with remembered trauma. He backed against the far wall of the stall, eyes rolling white with sudden fear. "See? He's already agitated," Ellie pleaded. "Please, at least wait until tomorrow. Let me help transition him." "That's enough," Thornton said firmly. "You've been paid for your services. We'll handle it from here." As the handler reached for Thunderstorm, the Mustang exploded into motion. Months of gentle progress evaporated in seconds as primal terror took over. He reared violently, striking out with his front hooves. The handler barely dodged the powerful blow, falling backward against the stall door. "What the hell?" Hayes shouted. "You said he was trained." "He is, with her." Thornton gestured toward Ellie. "He'll settle once we get him loaded." But Thunderstorm was beyond settling. The sudden appearance of handlers with restraints had triggered all his previous trauma. He crashed against the stall walls, wild-eyed and dangerous once again. "We'll need tranquilizers," Hayes decided. "Get the vet." "No." Ellie moved between them and the horse. "You'll undo everything." "Get her out of here," Thornton ordered, and the second handler grasped Ellie's arm, pulling her from the stall despite her struggles. "You're hurting him," she cried as Thunderstorm's panic intensified, his powerful body slamming against the walls in desperate attempts to escape. "This is ridiculous," Hayes snapped. "We'll come back with proper equipment. Let him exhaust himself first." The men retreated, dragging Ellie with them. At the barn entrance, Thornton turned to her, expression cold. "Go home, Ellie. Your part in this is over." Tears streaming down her face, Ellie ran from the fairgrounds, desperate to find Sophie, Pete, anyone who might help. The evening crowds had thinned, leaving only vendors packing up displays and cleaning crews beginning their work. She spotted Pete's truck in the distant parking area and sprinted toward it, lungs burning. Sophie and Pete were just returning, alarm crossing their faces at the sight of her distress. "They sold him," she gasped between sobs. "Hayes bought him. They're taking him to Texas tonight. They tried to force him, and now he's panicking." Pete's weathered face hardened. "Bastards. I knew they were planning something." "What can we do?" Sophie asked, her voice calm despite the crisis. "The sheriff," Pete decided. "Davis is fair, and I've been gathering evidence about that Mustang's capture. Might be enough to delay the transport at least." As they drove toward the sheriff's office, Ellie stared out the window, her heart breaking for Thunderstorm. Alone, terrified, his trust shattered once again by human betrayal. She touched the matching ribbons in her hair, identical to those in his mane, and whispered a desperate prayer to whoever might be listening. When Ellie arrived desperately at Sheriff Davis's office, she found not only Pete Jenkins with a folder full of evidence, but also Lisa Rodriguez, James Whitewolf, and, surprisingly, several classmates from school who had never shown interest in her before, all gathered with determination in their eyes. "They won't take Thunderstorm anywhere, not while we have something to say about it." Sheriff Davis's office buzzed with unexpected energy as Ellie burst through the door. The small room, normally quiet at this hour, held a gathering that made her stop in her tracks. Pete Jenkins stood by the window, his weathered hand resting on a thick manila folder. Lisa Rodriguez sat in a chair, her camera bag beside her feet. James Whitewolf and two other Lakota elders conversed quietly in the corner. Most surprising of all were the faces Ellie recognized from school: Amber from her biology class, Kyle from math, and even Brittany Collins, the cheerleader who had never acknowledged her existence until recently. "What's happening?" Ellie asked, her voice still raw from crying. Sheriff Davis looked up from his desk. "Your friend Pete here has been quite busy." He gestured to the folder. "Seems there might be some irregularities with how that Mustang was acquired." Pete nodded grimly. "I've been documenting things since Thornton brought Thunderstorm to Midnight Creek. The capture location, the conditions, the methods used." He turned to Ellie. "I used to work with the Bureau of Land Management before I retired. Some things about this horse's paperwork didn't add up." Lisa stepped forward. "And I have medical documentation of healed injuries consistent with illegal capture methods, plus evidence of ongoing abuse before your intervention." James Whitewolf's deep voice carried across the room. "The capture site lies within boundaries protected by the Treaty of 1868. Our tribal council has jurisdiction questions." Sheriff Davis rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Enough to justify a temporary hold, at least until we sort through the legalities." Ellie's heart leapt. "So you can stop them from taking him tonight?" "I can delay the transport on grounds of an active investigation," Davis replied. "But Thornton has powerful friends. This is temporary at best." "That's all we need," Pete said. "Just enough time to make our case." As the sheriff made calls, Ellie approached her classmates hesitantly. "Why are you all here?" Amber smiled shyly. "Mrs. Miller told us what was happening. We've all seen the videos of you and Thunderstorm." "That horse trusts you," Kyle added. "Anyone can see that. What they're doing isn't right." Brittany nodded, twirling a strand of blonde hair. "Plus, it's our town against some rich Texas dude. Pinecrest sticks together." The simple solidarity brought fresh tears to Ellie's eyes. For most of her life, she had existed on the margins of Pinecrest, neither fully accepted in town nor completely embraced on the reservation. Yet here were people from both worlds, united by concern for a horse they'd never touched and a girl they'd barely noticed before. Dawn painted the eastern sky with pink and gold as vehicles assembled outside Midnight Creek Ranch. Sheriff Davis's patrol SUV led the procession, followed by Pete's truck, Lisa's Jeep, and a surprising number of cars and pickups from town. Word had spread overnight through Pinecrest's intricate small-town network, text messages, phone calls, conversations at Lloyd's bar that spilled into determined action. Richard Thornton emerged from the ranch house in an expensive bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, his face darkening at the sight of the gathering. Randall Hayes stood on the porch behind him, already dressed in pressed jeans and a starched shirt, his expression calculating as he assessed the growing crowd. "What the hell is this?" Thornton demanded as Sheriff Davis approached. "Mr. Thornton," Davis began formally, "I'm here regarding the Mustang known as Thunderstorm. We have evidence suggesting irregularities in his capture and acquisition that require investigation." "That's absurd," Thornton scoffed. "I have all the proper documentation. The horse is legally mine to sell." "Nevertheless," Davis continued, "pending investigation, the animal will remain in Montana under protective custody." Hayes stepped forward, his voice smooth with practiced authority. "Sheriff, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding that my legal team can clarify." Davis remained unmoved. "My office will coordinate with the Bureau of Land Management and tribal authorities to review the case. Until then, the horse stays put." While they argued, Ellie slipped away toward the stables. She found Thunderstorm in his enclosure, pacing nervously, sides still heaving from the previous night's terror. When he spotted her, he froze, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with uncertainty, the trust they'd built damaged by the traumatic attempted loading. Instead of approaching, Ellie sat cross-legged on the ground outside his fence. She began humming softly, the same Lakota melody that had first connected them. Gradually, Thunderstorm's breathing slowed. He remained distant, but his ears turned toward her, remembering. By the time the confrontation at the ranch house concluded, a remarkable scene had developed. Around Ellie sat James Whitewolf and other Lakota elders, forming a semicircle. They sang traditional songs that spoke of freedom and respect, their deep voices carrying across the morning air. The Mustang had moved closer to the fence, still wary, but visibly calmer in the presence of the ancient melodies. Thornton and Hayes approached with Sheriff Davis, stopping short at the sight. "What is this? Some kind of Indian ritual?" Thornton asked derisively. James White Wolf rose slowly, his dignity unassailable. "We are reminding the horse who he is, not what humans have done to him. His spirit remembers freedom before yours tried to break it." Hayes studied the scene with cold calculation. "Charming cultural display, but ultimately irrelevant. My lawyers will resolve this promptly." He turned to Ellie. "Enjoy your time with the animal while you can, girl. My breeding program awaits him." As the men walked away, Davis lingered. "The horse will need to be transported to neutral ground while this plays out," he explained quietly. "County Animal Control Facility has agreed to house him." Ellie's stomach tightened with fresh anxiety. "Another move will traumatize him further." Lisa Rodriguez approached, having overheard. "I've arranged something better. The Equine Therapy Center outside Helena has offered space, professional staff, large paddocks, minimal stress. I'll oversee his care personally. And I'll make sure you have daily access," Davis added. The judge was clear. "You're the only handler approved to work with him during the custody period." The loading process proved delicate. Thunderstorm's trust had been severely shaken. Even with Ellie, he showed renewed wariness, flinching at sudden movements, eyes constantly scanning for threats. It took 3 hours of patient coaxing before he would enter the trailer, and only then with Ellie walking beside him, her hand gently resting on his neck, where the colored ribbons remained braided into his mane. During the 2-week investigation that followed, a routine emerged. Each morning, Ellie would arrive at the Equine Center, where Thunderstorm occupied a spacious paddock with a 3-sided shelter. Their first hour together was always the same. She would sit quietly at the edge of his space, sometimes reading aloud from her schoolbooks, sometimes singing softly, never demanding his attention but simply offering her presence. Gradually, day by day, the Mustang's trust began to rebuild. The first breakthrough came on the 4th day when he approached her of his own accord, cautiously sniffing her outstretched hand before retreating. By the 7th day, he allowed her to walk beside him around the paddock, their movements synchronized without any physical contact. Lisa documented each session, her camera capturing the subtle language developing between girl and horse, a raised eyebrow met with a flick of an ear, a slight shift in posture answered by corresponding movement. What observers saw as training, Ellie experienced as conversation. "You're rebuilding the neural pathways disrupted by trauma," Lisa explained one afternoon as she reviewed her footage. Each positive interaction literally rewires his brain to expect safety instead of threat. Meanwhile, the legal battle intensified. Thornton's attorneys filed motions to dismiss the investigation, arguing that any irregularities in the Mustang's capture were the responsibility of the original sellers, not the current owner. Hayes added pressure through business connections and political allies, seeking to expedite the process. But Pete's meticulous documentation proved difficult to dismiss. Photos comparing Thunderstorm's scars with documented cases of illegal capture techniques raised serious questions. Maps showed the capture location overlapping with lands protected under historic treaties with the Lakota Nation. News of the case spread beyond Pinecrest. A regional newspaper ran a front-page story featuring Lisa's photograph of Ellie and Thunderstorm, their matching ribbons bright against the Mustang's dark coat. Online forums for horse enthusiasts debated the ethics of traditional versus natural training methods. A small but vocal group of supporters began gathering daily outside the equine center, some carrying signs reading, "Let Thunder run free," and "Respect native wisdom." 13 days into the custody period, the preliminary hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse. The night before, Ellie sat with Sophie on their porch steps, anxiety making sleep impossible. "What if we lose, grandmother?" she whispered. "What if they send him to Texas?" Sophie's weathered hands continued braiding a new set of protective ribbons. "Then his spirit will remember yours, no matter where they take his body. That connection cannot be broken by courts or men." The courthouse lawn buzzed with activity as supporters and spectators gathered for the hearing. Thornton arrived in a luxury SUV flanked by 3 attorneys in expensive suits. Hayes followed in a separate vehicle, his confident stride suggesting a man accustomed to getting his way. Inside the packed courtroom, technical arguments dominated the morning session. Land boundaries, treaty jurisdictions, and federal regulations regarding wild horse captures created a complex legal landscape that left many observers confused. After lunch, James Whitewolf presented maps and historical documents demonstrating the spiritual significance of the area where Thunderstorm had been captured. "These are not just lines on paper," he explained to the judge. "These boundaries contain our sacred relationship with the land and its creatures." Lisa Rodriguez presented her scientific documentation next. Images of Thunderstorm's physical transformation under Ellie's care projected on a screen for all to see. "What we're witnessing is not just training," she concluded. "It's healing, psychological, physical, and spiritual recovery from profound trauma." As technical testimonies continued, Judge Eleanor Wilkins, a pragmatic woman with 30 years on the bench, interrupted proceedings with an unusual request. "I've heard enough expert opinions," she announced. "Before ruling, I want to see this horse and these people interacting for myself." An hour later, a remarkable scene unfolded on the courthouse lawn. Thunderstorm stood in a temporary enclosure, his dark coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The crowd maintained a respectful distance as the judge observed from a folding chair. "Mr. Thornton, Mr. Hayes," Judge Wilkins called. "Please approach the horse." The 2 men exchanged confident glances. Thornton took a carrot from his pocket and moved toward the enclosure. Hayes followed with practiced ease, clearly accustomed to handling valuable livestock. Thunderstorm's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His ears pinned flat against his skull, nostrils flared, and muscles tensed visibly beneath his glossy coat. When Thornton extended the carrot through the fence, the Mustang bared his teeth, pawing aggressively at the ground. "That's enough," the judge said after several uncomfortable minutes. "Ms. Blackwater, your turn." Ellie approached slowly, carrying nothing, offering nothing. She simply stood at the fence, her gaze soft and unfocused, and began to hum the now familiar melody. Thunderstorm's transformation was remarkable. Ears forward, posture relaxing, eyes softening. When she finally raised her hand, he moved to her willingly, pressing his muzzle into her palm with evident trust. Cameras clicked frantically, capturing the moment. The contrast could not have been more stark, the same animal showing 2 completely different selves depending on who stood before him. I believe I've seen what I needed to see, Judge Wilkins said, rising from her chair. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Judge Wilkins delivered her ruling to the assembled crowd. The technical aspects were complex, but the essence was clear. While Thornton's purchase was deemed technically legal, the original capture had indeed violated treaties with the Lakota Nation. As compensation, Thunderstorm would be transferred to the newly established Wild Mustang Recovery Program on the reservation, with Ellie designated as his primary caretaker. Thornton's face flushed with anger and humiliation. Cameras captured his terse statement, "Fine, keep the damned horse. It was just an investment that wasn't worth the trouble." As he stalked toward his vehicle, Pete Jenkins stepped into his path, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. "You never understood, did you?" the old rancher said quietly. "It was never about the horse. It was about recognizing a soul when you see one." Pete's words hung in the air as Thornton stalked away, shoulders rigid with wounded pride. The crowd began to disperse, their excited conversations fading into the cooling evening. For the first time in weeks, Ellie felt herself breathe fully, as if some invisible band around her chest had finally loosened. The following morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to mirror Ellie's newfound hope. But Thornton's legal team moved swiftly, filing appeals before the courthouse doors had even opened. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Davis arrived at the Equine Center with news that tempered their victory. "Thornton's lawyers are challenging the ruling on multiple fronts," he explained, his weathered face grave as he watched Ellie brush Thunderstorm's gleaming coat. "They're claiming tribal jurisdiction doesn't apply since the ranch isn't on reservation land, and that the treaty boundaries were modified in 1912. Ellie's hand stilled on Thunderstorm's neck. "But the judge already ruled." "The judge made a preliminary determination," Davis corrected gently. "These things get complicated. Thornton has resources to drag this out for months." Lisa Rodriguez, who had been documenting Thunderstorm's improved physical condition, set down her camera with a frustrated sigh. "Of course he does. Men like that believe everything has a price, including justice." For 2 weeks, Thunderstorm remained at the Equine Center while legal filings accumulated. Ellie visited daily, her school granting special permission for her afternoon absences, given the educational nature of her work. Each day followed a similar pattern. Upon arriving, she would simply sit outside his paddock, sometimes reading aloud from her homework, sometimes humming softly, allowing him to approach on his terms. The Mustang's psychological state fluctuated visibly. Some days he would greet her at the fence immediately, eyes bright with recognition. Other days, particularly after strangers had visited the facility, he would retreat to the far corner of his paddock, watchful and wary, requiring hours of patient presence before he would approach. "He's like a living barometer," Lisa observed one afternoon, reviewing her footage. "His body language reflects every shift in the emotional atmosphere around him. Notice how his ears position differently when the facility staff change shifts. He remembers which humans move quickly or make sudden noises." Ellie nodded, recognizing the truth in Lisa's analysis. "It's like he's always waiting for the betrayal to happen again." "Exactly. Trauma creates that constant vigilance," Lisa replied, her voice softening. "Which makes what you've accomplished even more remarkable. You've given him moments where he doesn't have to be vigilant." As the legal battle intensified, so did public interest. A regional news station sent a reporter to film a segment about the Mustang case, interviewing Lisa about her documentation of alternative training methods and Pete about his knowledge of wild horse regulations. When they approached Ellie for an interview, she declined politely, uncomfortable with the attention. "Let the science speak," she told Lisa afterward. "People will listen to your credentials more than a teenage girl." But Ellie's reluctance to seek the spotlight only seemed to increase public fascination. Cell phone videos of her working with Thunderstorm circulated online, catching the attention of natural horsemanship communities across the country. Comment sections filled with debates about traditional training versus relationship-based approaches, often with distinctly cultural undertones. "The Lakota have been doing this for centuries," wrote one commenter. Western culture just branded it as new and alternative, once white trainers started doing it. 23 days after the initial hearing, Judge Wilkins called both parties back to court. The small county courtroom could barely contain all who wished to attend. Reporters from national outlets crowded the back wall, while the benches filled with Pinecrest residents, Lakota community members, and horse enthusiasts who had traveled from neighboring states. Thornton arrived with an expanded legal team, now 5 attorneys strong. Hayes sat behind them, his confident smile suggesting inside knowledge of a favorable outcome. Ellie sat between Sophie and James White Wolf, trying to appear calmer than she felt. The technical arguments consumed the morning session. Thornton's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman from a prestigious Denver firm, presented historical documentation challenging the treaty boundaries and questioned the jurisdiction of tribal claims on privately purchased land. "What we have here," she concluded, "is an emotional response being disguised as a legal one. Mr. Thornton purchased this animal legally, invested significantly in its care, and has every right to sell his property as he sees fit." After lunch, the proceedings took an unexpected turn when Judge Wilkins invited an equine behavior specialist from Montana State University to provide expert testimony. Dr. Robert McIntyre, a gray-haired man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had reviewed Lisa's documentation extensively. "What we're observing with this Mustang is textbook trauma response," he explained, gesturing toward charts displaying Thunderstorm's physical markers before and after Ellie's intervention. Elevated cortisol levels, hypervigilance, aggressive defensive behavior, all consistent with severe psychological trauma. "And your assessment of Ms. Blackwater's approach?" the judge prompted. "Remarkable," Dr. McIntyre stated firmly. "Without formal training, she's implemented techniques that align perfectly with our most current understanding of equine psychology. Her intuitive method of allowing proximity without pressure creates neural safety patterns that conventional training often disrupts." When Thornton's attorney attempted to dismiss the testimony as irrelevant to ownership rights, Judge Wilkins raised her hand. "The well-being of the animal is central to this case," she stated firmly. "If Mr. Thornton's planned sale would likely return this horse to a traumatic state, that matters to this court." By late afternoon, both sides had presented their arguments. Judge Wilkins studied her notes in silence while the courtroom held its collective breath. When she finally looked up, her expression was resolute. "This court finds itself at the intersection of property law, treaty rights, and ethical considerations regarding animal welfare," she began. "While Mr. Thornton did purchase the Mustang through seemingly proper channels, evidence strongly suggests the animal was captured illegally from protected lands." She paused, removing her reading glasses. "Furthermore, the documented trauma this animal has experienced and its exceptional response to Ms. Blackwater's care cannot be dismissed as irrelevant. The law must sometimes bend toward justice when strict application would perpetuate harm." The courtroom remained utterly silent as she continued. "Therefore, pending final resolution of the treaty boundary question, which may take considerable time, Thunderstorm will remain under protective custody at a neutral facility. During this period, only Ms. Blackwater is authorized to work with the animal, as abrupt changes in handling have been demonstrated to cause significant distress." It wasn't a complete victory, but it granted precious time. As people filed out of the courtroom, Thornton confronted Ellie in the hallway, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "This isn't over," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "That horse is worth $500,000 to the right buyer. No judge's bleeding heart is going to stand in my way for long." Sophie appeared beside her granddaughter, her ancient eyes meeting Thornton's without flinching. "The only thing that truly belongs to any of us, Mr. Thornton, is the consequences of our actions. Remember that." The following day, Ellie arrived at the Equine Center to find Thunderstorm unusually agitated. News crews had visited that morning, their unfamiliar vehicles and equipment disturbing the peaceful routine of the facility. The Mustang paced the perimeter of his paddock, nostrils flared, muscles twitching beneath his glossy coat. Instead of approaching, Ellie settled cross-legged on the ground at a distance, opening her biology textbook. She began reading aloud, her voice deliberately steady and rhythmic, discussing cell division and mitochondrial function as if these were the most natural topics to share with a traumatized horse. For nearly an hour, Thunderstorm continued pacing, occasionally stopping to stare at her before resuming his nervous circuit. Ellie maintained her calm recitation, never directly addressing him, simply creating a steady auditory presence in his chaotic emotional landscape. Gradually, the Mustang's movements slowed. His circuits became less frantic, his pauses between pacing longer. Finally, he stopped at the far corner of the paddock, regarding Ellie with cautious attention. The mitochondria, she continued, is often called the powerhouse of the cell because it generates most of the chemical energy needed to power the cell's biochemical reactions. Thunderstorm took one step toward her, then another. His ears, previously pinned back in stress, now pointed forward in curiosity. By the time Ellie finished the chapter, he stood at the fence nearest her, his breathing synchronized with the cadence of her voice. Only then did she acknowledge him directly, raising her eyes to meet his. "Hello, friend," she said softly. The Mustang exhaled deeply, as if releasing the tension he'd been carrying all morning. Lisa, who had been documenting the interaction from a distance, approached quietly. "That was beautiful," she said. "You didn't try to fix his anxiety. You just created space where he could fix it himself." "That's what my grandmother taught me," Ellie replied, rising slowly to her feet. "You can't force healing. You can only create conditions where it's possible." Over the next several weeks, a new routine established itself. Each morning, Lisa would collect physiological data on Thunderstorm, heart rate, respiratory patterns, stress hormone levels in saliva samples. After school, Ellie would arrive for their daily session, often accompanied by James White Wolf or other elders who shared traditional knowledge about the relationship between humans and horses. "Our ancestors didn't see horses as tools," James explained one afternoon as he watched Ellie gently introduce Thunderstorm to a soft rope, not to control him, but to desensitize him to equipment that had previously triggered fear. They saw them as relatives with their own medicine, their own purpose. The first Lakota to approach horses spoke to them as equals, not as creatures to be dominated. Local support continued to grow. Sarah Miller brought her biology class to observe and document the Blackwater method for their semester project. Several of Ellie's classmates began stopping by after school, initially curious about the famous Mustang, but gradually developing genuine interest in the work itself. "Could you teach me how to do that?" asked Amber one afternoon, watching Ellie guide Thunderstorm through a simple pattern using only subtle body language. "It's not really teaching," Ellie explained, struggling to articulate what had always felt intuitive. "It's more about listening than telling. Horses already know how to be horses. They're just trying to figure out if humans are safe." On a bright Tuesday morning, National Geographic photographer Thomas Reynolds arrived at the Equine Center, his rental car packed with sophisticated camera equipment. When Ellie arrived that afternoon, she found him setting up a blind at a respectful distance from Thunderstorm's paddock. "Dr. Rodriguez's research caught our attention," he explained. "We're doing a special issue on revolutionary approaches to wildlife rehabilitation. Your work with Thunderstorm might be featured alongside projects from around the world." When a team from National Geographic arrived to film a documentary special, among the visitors was the renowned equine behavior specialist, Dr. Robert McIntyre, who confessed with humility, "I've studied horses for 40 years, but I came here to learn from you, because you've rediscovered something that modern science forgot, how to speak the oldest language in the world." Dr. McIntyre's words lingered in the air like a benediction. His admission that decades of scientific expertise might bow to the intuitive wisdom of a teenage girl sent ripples through the growing community that had gathered around Thunderstorm and Ellie. The National Geographic team captured the moment, their cameras silently documenting what many were beginning to recognize as something beyond a legal case or a training methodology. This was about remembering what had been forgotten. 3 days after the judge's ruling, Ellie sat with Sophie and James White Wolf at their kitchen table, steam rising from mugs of pine needle tea as they reviewed a document that would change everything. "The Tribal Council has approved the allocation," James explained, spreading a simple map across the worn wooden surface. 5 acres on the eastern boundary, where Singing Creek meets the old hunting grounds. Sophie traced the outline with her weathered finger. Good land, protected from the north wind. The horses will be content there. Horses? Ellie looked up. Plural? James nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The council believes Thunderstorm is just the beginning. There are other Mustangs out there with similar stories. Captured, traumatized, deemed unmanageable. Your work has opened a door, little sister. The next morning, Ellie visited a small bank in Pinecrest, nervousness fluttering in her stomach as she sat beside Sophie in plastic chairs across from the loan officer. The man, middle-aged with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed their modest application. So this would be for construction of basic facilities for a horse rehabilitation program on reservation land? He clarified, looking up from the paperwork. Yes, Sophie answered. Initially just 2 paddocks, a simple shelter, and fencing. The man leaned back, studying them thoughtfully. Normally, this would be a challenging approval, limited collateral, the land being on the reservation. He smiled suddenly. But my daughter hasn't stopped talking about Thunderstorm since she visited the equine center with her biology class. Mrs. Blackwater, Miss Blackwater, I believe Pinecrest National is prepared to support this endeavor. Word of the project spread quickly. The following Saturday, Ellie arrived at the designated land to find an unexpected sight. Trucks and cars parked along the access road, and at least 30 people gathered with tools, work gloves, and determination. Pete Jenkins directed operations from the tailgate of his pickup, marking post-hole locations with bright orange flags. "Hope you don't mind the surprise," he said as Ellie approached, her expression a mixture of shock and gratitude. Folks wanted to help. The group represented a cross-section of Pinecrest that Ellie had never seen working together. Ranch hands from neighboring properties, teachers from the high school, several of her classmates, tribal members from the reservation, and even Donna Carla from the Quick Stop, distributing cold drinks from a large cooler. Sheriff Davis hammered fence posts alongside James White Wolf, their conversation flowing easily despite representing institutions that had historically been at odds. Lisa Rodriguez had set up a small table where she spread blueprints for the paddock design, optimized for the psychological well-being of traumatized horses. By sunset, the framework of the first paddock stood completed, corner posts solid in the Montana soil, the perimeter marked and partially fenced. As people began packing up tools, Sophie called everyone to gather in a circle. James White Wolf offered a traditional blessing, his deep voice carrying across the land that would soon become a place of healing. Even those unfamiliar with Lakota ways stood respectfully, hats removed, heads bowed. "The land remembers," Sophie said simply when James finished. "Today it remembers what community truly means. Thank you all." Over the following weeks, construction continued every weekend. The single paddock became 2, then 3. A simple shelter rose against the eastern boundary, designed to offer protection while allowing anxious horses clear sight lines in all directions. A detail Ellie had insisted upon, knowing how crucial it was for traumatized animals to monitor their surroundings. Lisa installed unobtrusive cameras at strategic points, explaining to visitors, "We're documenting everything scientifically. Ellie's intuitive approach works, but for it to be adopted more widely, we need data that proves why it works." The National Geographic documentary team returned periodically, capturing the project's evolution. Their presence lent an unexpected legitimacy that attracted attention beyond Pinecrest. A professor from the veterinary program at Montana State University arranged a visit with graduate students. A foundation supporting indigenous knowledge preservation contacted James about potential grant funding. Throughout this flurry of activity, Thunderstorm remained at the Equine Center, his fate still technically undetermined as Thornton's legal challenges continued. Ellie visited daily, their bond deepening beyond what either could have imagined during their first frightened encounter. One crisp morning in late October, Dr. McIntyre joined Ellie's session, observing quietly as she worked with Thunderstorm on accepting gentle touch on areas that still triggered anxiety. particularly his ears and the underside of his jaw, places where handlers had likely been rough during his capture. "Remarkable," McIntyre murmured as the Mustang gradually relaxed, allowing Ellie's fingers to stroke the sensitive areas. Most conventional trainers would use restraints for this kind of desensitization. "He needs to know he can leave if it becomes too much," Ellie explained, stepping back immediately when Thunderstorm tossed his head, signaling discomfort. "Trust only grows when choice remains." McIntyre nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking about what to call your approach for my research papers. The Blackwater method seems appropriate." Ellie smiled shyly. "My grandmother would say it's not my method at all. It belongs to ancestors I never met." "Perhaps remembered wisdom then," McIntyre suggested, honoring that this knowledge was never truly lost, merely forgotten by some of us. 6 months after the initial confrontation at Quickstop, the final legal hurdles cleared unexpectedly. Thornton, facing mounting legal costs and increasingly negative publicity, withdrew his appeals. His terse statement to the press spoke volumes. "The horse is no longer worth the investment of my time or resources. The reservation program can have him." The day Thunderstorm would finally move to his permanent home dawned clear and cold. Frost silvered the grass as Ellie arrived at the equine center for the transfer. Despite all their preparation, anxiety knotted her stomach. The Mustang had experienced so much trauma during previous transports. Lisa had brought a specialized trailer designed with skittish horses in mind: lower sides for better visibility, rubber flooring for secure footing, more space to prevent the trapped feeling that triggered panic. Even so, when Thunderstorm first saw the trailer, his body tensed visibly, memories of past terror surfacing in his widened eyes and flared nostrils. Instead of forcing the issue, Ellie simply sat on the ground near the trailer's open ramp, a small drum borrowed from James Whitewolf in her lap. She began a gentle rhythm, matching it to Thunderstorm's breathing, then gradually slowing. The Mustang's ears flicked toward the sound, his attention divided between the threatening trailer and the comforting familiarity of Ellie's presence. For nearly 2 hours, she simply existed in that liminal space with him, occasionally singing softly, never demanding movement, creating a bubble of patience in a world that rarely offered it. Gradually, Thunderstorm's curiosity overcame his fear. He approached the trailer cautiously, sniffing its unfamiliar surfaces, retreating when anxiety spiked, then approaching again. When he finally walked up the ramp of his own accord, following Ellie's calm presence rather than being driven by fear, Lisa whispered to Dr. McIntyre, "That's the difference between compliance and cooperation. Most trainers settle for the first, never experiencing the second." The drive to the new facility took 40 minutes, Ellie riding in the trailer with Thunderstorm, maintaining the connection that grounded him through the stressful journey. When they arrived, a small gathering waited at a respectful distance: Sophie, James, Pete, and a few others who had been integral to creating this sanctuary. Thunderstorm emerged cautiously, nostrils flaring as he scented the new environment. The paddock before him, spacious with clear sightlines to distant mountains, sweet grass underfoot, and a 3-sided shelter that offered protection without confinement, represented everything the program stood for: freedom within safety, boundaries without imprisonment. For several long moments, the Mustang stood motionless at the threshold, Ellie quiet beside him. Then, with deliberate dignity, he stepped forward into his new home, his choice a testament to how far they had come together. Over the weeks that followed, an extraordinary transformation took shape. What had begun as one horse and one girl expanded organically. A neighbor contacted Sophie about an Arabian mare so traumatized by abusive training that she attacked anyone who approached. A rancher from the next county arrived with a quarter-horse gelding who had developed dangerous neurotic behaviors after being kept in isolation. Each new arrival followed a similar pattern: initial wariness, gradual trust building, and eventual reintegration into healthy equine social behavior, with Thunderstorm often serving as a stabilizing presence for newcomers. His own journey from terror to trust somehow communicated to other damaged horses. Healing is possible here. Ellie developed a careful system, working with Lisa to document each horse's specific triggers and progress. No two traumas are identical, she explained to Sarah Miller's advanced biology class during their field trip. Each horse tells you what they need if you listen carefully enough. Community involvement continued to expand. Several Lakota teenagers began apprenticing with Ellie after school, learning the delicate balance of patience and presence that formed the core of the program. Donna Carla organized a group of local businesses to sponsor a horse, covering feed and veterinary costs. The high school woodshop class built specialized equipment designed for traumatized equines, pressure-free barriers, approach areas that allowed horses to retreat safely if overwhelmed. One afternoon, as Ellie observed 3 Lakota apprentices working with a newly arrived Mustang, Sophie joined her at the fence. "Your mother would be proud," she said softly. She always believed the old ways had purpose in the new world. Ellie nodded, throat tight with emotion. "I just wish she could see this." "She does," Sophie replied simply. "Not all seeing happens through these eyes." She gestured toward the expanding facility, now featuring 5 paddocks, a small treatment area, and a gathering space where visitors could learn about the program without disturbing the horses. "You've healed more than horses, granddaughter. Look around you." Ellie followed her gesture, truly seeing what had grown almost imperceptibly day by day. Where racial tensions had once divided Pinecrest, people now worked side by side. Where traditional knowledge had been dismissed as superstition, scientists now documented its effectiveness. Where she had once walked alone, a community now stood with shared purpose. A sign near the entrance, recently installed by the tribal council, read simply, "Sophie Blackwater Equine Recovery Center," honoring the grandmother whose wisdom had made everything possible. Years later, guides in Montana would tell visitors that on certain nights when the moon is full, you can still see the silhouette of a magnificent black Mustang and his inseparable rider galloping across the hills. 2 spirits who, upon finding each other, not only healed themselves but began a ripple of healing that continues to spread like waves on a lake, proving that sometimes the gentlest whisper can echo farther than the loudest shout. The morning light streamed through Ellie's dormitory window, casting golden patterns across textbooks on equine physiology and veterinary medicine. Photos lined her small desk, images of Thunderstorm, the recovery center, and the growing herd of rehabilitated horses that had found sanctuary there. 2 years had passed since the courtroom battle, yet sometimes she still woke with a start, momentarily afraid it had all been a dream. Her phone chimed with an incoming video call. Sophie's face appeared on screen, weathered and beautiful, framed by the familiar kitchen of their home. "Good morning, grandmother," Ellie greeted, adjusting her position so the morning light didn't obscure her face. "The center received another call," Sophie said without preamble. "A racing stable outside Billings. They have a thoroughbred who collapsed during training. The owners want to put him down, but their veterinarian suggested us instead." Lisa Rodriguez leaned into frame beside Sophie, her notebook visible in hand. "His injuries aren't life-threatening, but he's developed severe anxiety responses. Classic PTSD in equines. Are you coming home this weekend? We should evaluate him together." "I'll be there Friday afternoon," Ellie confirmed, already mentally rearranging her study schedule. Her professors had grown accustomed to her weekend absences, recognizing that her work at the recovery center complemented her veterinary studies in ways no classroom could match. 3 hours later, Ellie's compact car crested the hill overlooking Pinecrest. The town appeared largely unchanged. Lloyd's Bar still sported its faded sign, Quick Stop's gas prices were still the highest in the county, but something fundamental had shifted in how it felt. Where invisible barriers had once divided communities, connections now flourished, many of them traced directly to the Sophie Blackwater Equine Recovery Center. The moment Ellie's tires crunched on the gravel road leading to the center, a distinctive sound reached her, a powerful whinny that rose above all others. Despite the distance, Thunderstorm had recognized the particular rhythm of her car's engine. This had become their ritual, their greeting across space. By the time she parked, he was already waiting at the fence of the main paddock, head high, ears forward in expectation. "I missed you too," she called, quickening her pace toward him. Thunderstorm's transformation remained the most profound testimony to the center's work. The once terrified, aggressive Mustang now stood as its ambassador, still proud and spirited, but without the desperate fear that had driven his violence. His coat gleamed with health, and the scars beneath his mane had faded to faint lines, visible only to those who knew where to look. "He heard your car from half a mile away," said James White Wolf, approaching from the small office building that had been added the previous year. "Refused his afternoon hay until you arrived." Ellie reached the fence, and Thunderstorm immediately pressed his muzzle against her outstretched hand, inhaling deeply as if reconfirming her scent after their separation. The gesture, simple, trusting, freely offered, never failed to humble her. "How's the new program going?" she asked James as she stroked Thunderstorm's forehead. 7 children this week," he replied, satisfaction evident in his voice. "The horse therapy sessions are showing remarkable results. Sarah Miller's nephew, the one who hasn't spoken since the car accident last year. He said his first words yesterday while grooming Thunder's friend, the little paint mare." The center had evolved far beyond its original vision. What began as a refuge for traumatized horses had expanded organically to include programs for traumatized humans. Children with special needs, veterans with PTSD, adults recovering from abuse, all found healing in the presence of animals who understood trauma without requiring explanations. Lisa emerged from the assessment paddock where the new thoroughbred would be evaluated. "The transport from Billings arrives tomorrow morning," she announced. "Initial reports suggest extreme startle responses and aggressive defensive behaviors. Classic case of human-induced trauma." Thunder should be present for the evaluation, Ellie decided, watching how the Mustang's ears tracked their conversation. "He helps the new arrivals settle faster." The center now employed 6 full-time staff, 2 Lakota youth who had apprenticed with Ellie since the beginning, a retired military veterinarian, Lisa on weekends, and 2 therapists specializing in equine-assisted healing. What had begun as Ellie's intuitive approach had gradually developed into a structured methodology that maintained the core principle: healing happens in relationship, not isolation. After a thorough inspection of the facilities and updates on each horse's progress, Ellie returned to Thunderstorm's paddock with curry brush in hand. Their grooming sessions had always been more than maintenance. They were conversation, connection, mutual care. "University's going well," she told him as she worked, her voice falling into the rhythmic cadence that had first bridged their worlds. "Learning lots of scientific names for things we already knew, you and I." Thunderstorm's muscles relaxed progressively under her touch, his eyelids drooping in contentment. He had learned to enjoy physical contact, a profound achievement for an animal whose body had known only pain from human hands. "The documentary aired last week," she continued. "People from 17 countries have contacted the center since then. Turns out we're not the only ones who believe there's a better way." The National Geographic special had exceeded all expectations, presenting the center's work not as a curiosity, but as a revolutionary approach to trauma recovery across species. Dr. McIntyre's research papers on the Blackwater method now appeared in veterinary textbooks, challenging generations of dominance-based training techniques. That evening, community members gathered for the monthly potluck dinner that had become tradition. Picnic tables arranged beneath cottonwood trees held an array of dishes reflecting Pinecrest's diverse cultural threads. Sophie's traditional wajapi berry pudding beside Donna Carla's empanadas, Sarah Miller's apple pie alongside James White Wolf's wild rice and venison. The gathering had grown organically, much like the center itself. Initially just staff and volunteers, it had expanded to include families of children in the therapy program, then neighbors, then visitors from further afield drawn by the center's growing reputation. As twilight softened the landscape, Pete Jenkins approached Ellie with a mug of coffee. At 74, he remained actively involved in the center's operations, his knowledge of land management proving invaluable as they expanded. "Did you hear about Thornton?" he asked, settling beside her on a bench overlooking the paddocks. Ellie shook her head. "Oil company went bankrupt. Market crash or some such. Word is he had to sell that fancy Texas ranch of his." Pete sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Funny how things circle around. Man who thought he could own anything worth having ends up losing what matters. Midnight Creek Ranch had been purchased the previous year by a cooperative of local ranchers, transforming it from a single-owner showcase to a sustainable operation that employed several Pinecrest residents. The symmetry wasn't lost on Ellie. What had begun with conflict over a single horse had catalyzed change that rippled outward in unexpected ways. As darkness fell, the gathering transitioned to its beloved conclusion. James White Wolf and other elders assembled traditional drums, their rhythmic heartbeat drawing everyone into a circle. Horses in nearby paddocks turned attentive ears toward the sound, some drawing closer to the fences to observe. Tomorrow, Sophie announced to the gathered community, we officially open the new youth program building. She gestured toward the recently completed structure, a round building designed to honor traditional Lakota architecture while incorporating modern therapeutic facilities. Our children will learn from these horses that trauma does not define destiny. That trust, once broken, can be rebuilt. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, autumn painting the surrounding hills in amber and gold. After breakfast, Ellie prepared for a different kind of ceremony, the traditional ride that had become symbolic of the center's mission. She approached Thunderstorm's paddock empty-handed, no halter, no lead rope, no saddle. The Mustang stood waiting, already understanding what would follow. With practiced ease, Ellie opened the gate and stepped inside. Horse and human regarded each other for a moment of mutual recognition before Thunderstorm lowered his head, inviting her to grasp his mane. In a fluid movement born of countless repetitions, Ellie swung onto his bare back. The ribbons in her hair, red, blue, yellow, and white, matched those braided into his mane, symbols not of ownership, but of partnership. At a subtle shift of her weight, Thunderstorm moved forward. Behind them, a line of riders formed, Lakota youth on horses they had helped rehabilitate, each pair a testament to mutual healing. Their progress through the property drew staff and visitors to pause and watch the procession of transformed lives. The riders followed a trail that wound up into the surrounding hills, eventually reaching a ridge that overlooked both the recovery center and, in the distance, the former Thornton property. When they reached this vantage point, Thunderstorm slowed without prompting, his gaze fixing on the distant fences that had once enclosed him. Something passed through his powerful body, a tremor of remembrance, perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement of how far they had traveled from that first desperate encounter. Ellie leaned forward, her words meant only for him. "You're free now," she whispered against his ear. "We both are." Thunderstorm nickered softly in response, then turned away from the view of his former prison. With a gentle pressure from Ellie's legs, he broke into a gallop across the open hillside, the other horses and riders following in a display of joyous movement. Visitors to the Sophie Blackwater Equine Recovery Center often reported this sight as the most moving part of their experience. The weekly ceremonial ride where horses once deemed dangerous or broken ran with the fluid grace of their wild ancestors, carrying riders who had earned their trust through patience rather than force. From the center's observation deck, tourists watched through binoculars as the distant figures moved across the golden landscape. The colored ribbons streaming in the wind caught the sunlight, visible from great distances, no longer symbols of domestication, but emblems of the rarest freedom, that which comes when two beings choose each other freely, again and again. Years later, guides in Montana would tell visitors that on certain evenings when the moon is full, you can still see the silhouette of a magnificent black Mustang and his inseparable rider galloping across the hills. Two spirits who, upon finding each other, not only healed themselves, but began a ripple of healing that continues to spread like waves on a lake, proving that sometimes the gentlest whisper can echo farther than the loudest shout.